The dawn light filtered weakly through the thick canopy of the ancient forest as smoke curled like restless spirits around the iron cage. Flames licked hungrily at the wooden frame, casting hellish shadows across the desperate faces trapped within. Ivranos shielded Fatima with his body, the heat searing their skin, while Urhan Sahab, his face etched with unyielding fury, swung the massive hammer again and again. Each powerful strike rang out like thunder, sparks flying as metal protested against metal. Sweat poured down the Sultan's brow, his muscles straining with every blow until finally, with a deafening crack, the cage shattered. Ivranos quickly draped a cloak over Fatima to protect her modesty and dignity amidst the chaos. Together, with Urhan's strong arm guiding them, they emerged from the inferno. The moment her feet touched the earth, Fatima collapsed into Halima's waiting embrace. Halima held her tightly, whispering urgent questions about her well-being, her voice trembling with relief. Joy rippled through their loyal companions like a wave after a storm. Aspoka stepped forward, her eyes shining with quiet wisdom, and said that just as they had escaped this fiery prison, Ivranos had freed himself from the many invisible chains that once bound him. Ivranos turned to her in astonishment, searching her face. Aspoka continued, revealing the truth that cut through the tension like a blade. Anastasia was Andreas's daughter, and this entire web of deception had been Daphne's twisted game. A heavy breath of relief escaped Ivranos as the weight lifted from his shoulders. Fatima's voice grew sharp with resolve, declaring that Daphne would meet her end by their hands. Ivranos nodded grimly, stating that the time had come. The others agreed that Daphne had already lived far longer than she deserved, and now the dark earth claimed its due. Orhan Sahab raised his voice with commanding presence. They would spread through the forest like wolves on the hunt, ensuring she could bring no more harm to anyone. With determined hearts, the group pressed forward into the shadows. As night yielded to the pale fingers of morning, the scene shifted to where Dosun lay motionless on the forest floor, his loyal horse standing watch like a silent guardian. His companions burst through the undergrowth, hearts pounding. Mustafa knelt beside him, feeling the faint rise and fall of breath. "He lives," he shouted with fierce joy. "Bring the horses, quickly." Soldiers scrambled while Mustafa pressed cloth to the wound, urging his brother to endure. "Hold on, my brother, hold on." Meanwhile, deeper in the wild woods, Daphne fled like a hunted animal, her breaths ragged branches tearing at her clothes. Halima, Fatima, and the women warriors tracked her relentlessly. Halima examined the fresh tracks and signaled. The signs were recent. They would fan out. Aspoka, Halima, and Fatima separated like shadows, moving with lethal grace. Halima spotted her prey and charged forward, vowing aloud that she would end her. Daphne hissed a curse upon the heavens as Halima closed in. The clash was ferocious. Daphne lunged with deadly precision, forcing Halima to dodge with agile speed. The momentum sent Halima tumbling to the ground, but she rolled to her feet. Daphne advanced, promising to carve that beloved face into ruin. Before the killing blow could fall, Aspoka's thrown dagger whistled through the air and struck true. Daphne crumpled, gasping. Fatima and Aspoka rushed to Halima, lifting her as she assured them she was unharmed. Daphne dragged herself against a tree, her voice dripping venom even as life ebbed away. She taunted Aspoka, claiming she had planted seeds of eternal anger in her sister's heart, that Aspoka would forever live in Nilufar's shadow as nothing more than the second woman. Rage surged in Aspoka, but Fatima restrained her, declaring Daphne unworthy. Still defiant in her agony, Daphne laughed through the pain, reopening old wounds. How she had humiliated Fatima before her entire family on her wedding day. Would shame return with any new marriage? Halima silenced the venom, reminding her that death approached, and yet she still chose to strike like a serpent. Daphne's laughter turned hollow as she mocked Halima's temper over wisdom, prophesying she would never become the Bey's wife, that Dosun would never stand beside her. Then, with a final shudder, Daphne's body went limp, collapsing into the dirt. Fatima stood over her and spoke with quiet finality. Daphne had forced them to endure immense pain, but she would harm no one again. Her fate was sealed. The forest seemed to exhale as the scene shifted once more. Yakid ran desperately through the trees, Evranos hot on his trail. His breaths came in panicked gasps until Urhan Sahab emerged ahead, blocking all escape. "There is nowhere left for you, Yakid," the Sultan declared, his voice like forged steel. "Drop your sword." Yakid was swiftly encircled. One of the commanders urged him to face death with at least some honor. From the side, Fatima, Aspoka, and Halima joined the tightening noose. Realizing his doom, Yakid let his blade fall. As a man moved to claim it, Fatima confronted him coldly. The woman he conspired with, Daphne, was already dead. No one remained to save him. Despite all his schemes and betrayals, he had failed to tear them apart. He had lost. Evranos added that Yaqub's days of deception were over. Orhan Sahib's gaze burned with certainty. You and your father fell prey to greed. You thought to murder Orhan and claim Bursa for yourselves. With those words, the Sultan delivered a resounding slap that sent Yaqub sprawling. Towering above him with sword drawn, Orhan continued, "Evil always meets defeat." Yaqub spat back accusations of hypocrisy and arrogance. Orhan replied that he could take his life but would not stain his blade with such filth. Yaqub then reached for a hidden weapon in desperation. Orhan's voice rang out. His blood was that of traitors, and so he would hang like one. "Take him away." Yet as Orhan turned, Yaqub lunged in a final treacherous attack. Shouts of alarm rose. Orhan pivoted with lightning speed, driving the traitor's own weapon deep into his body with overwhelming force. Yaqub collapsed, life fading from his eyes. Fatima watched with a flicker of unease, but Orhan declared justice had been served. In the grand halls of Bursa, Nilufer stood lost in deep contemplation, her heart heavy with the burdens of her role. Maluhan Tatun approached with maternal grace and reminded her that Orhan had entrusted her with what he held most precious. Nilufer confessed her readiness to give her life for this path, yet fear lingered that she might betray her sultan's trust. Malhun gently warned that fear makes one weak, but she must never forget the strength within her heart. As guardian of the realm's trust, she must embrace every duty for lasting peace. Nilufer's resolve hardened. The past of jealousy and anger was buried. From now on, she would strive tirelessly to preserve their dominion. There was much work ahead. Malhun embraced her daughter with pride and warmth. Far away in the shadowed halls of the Samandria fortress, Shahanshah paced in troubled thought. Andreas arrived, assuring him that victory was near. Their long-desired throne and ambitions were within grasp. Shahanshah recounted old hunts with Osman, how young Orhan had once proven his mettle in the dangerous wilds of Kajil Jakaya during a storm, returning with game when others had turned back. Andreas was warned not to underestimate Orhan Sahib, yet the Byzantine ruler remained confident. One was hunter, the other prey. A soldier's urgent cry interrupted them, gates opening for a body being brought in. Out on the open plains near Gemlik, Orhan Sahib and Aspoka rode side by side on horseback, the wind carrying the scent of coming war. The Sultan noted they were close to parting ways for now. Aspoka's voice softened with concern. He must take care and remain vigilant. Orhan observed she had not always been this way. Aspoka reflected on how life beside him had awakened a side of her she never knew existed. He replied that he knew this Aspoka deeply, they were alike in spirit. For the first time, he did not need to strive to understand, he simply saw her. Their shared wounds and fears had aligned their hearts in rhythm. Aspoka spoke of her past, where emotions were buried deep and words of the heart remained unspoken. Yet with him, every hidden feeling found its voice. It was unfamiliar, even frightening in its power, yet she felt no fear. Orhan replied that when fear departs, one draws closer to their true self. They had long fled from each other, but now no path of escape remained. With those words, he offered her strength and reassurance as they rode on, the weight of love and impending battle binding them closer than ever. The chapter closed on this fragile peace amid gathering storms, the forest whispering of trials yet to come, and the call of destiny echoing across the hills where Orhan Sahib's legacy would be forged in blood and faith.
And as the last words of that ride settled into the air, when the darkness itself seemed to lean closer to listen, the Sultan drew the reins as the ground beneath the hooves turned firmer, stone giving way to a half-buried path that only the local guides would recognize. The night was not quiet, it was watching. Somewhere beyond the black silhouettes of hills, a distant fire breathed orange light through mist, and thin smoke, like a warning drawn in ink, stretched toward the stars. Sultan and Esposa moved through it as if they were two secrets walking side by side, their horses' breath fogging in the cold, their armor catching stray glints whenever the wind shifted. Gemlik was close now. The air tasted of salt and iron, the way it always did near sea roads, near old fortifications where battles had once been decided by whoever arrived first with courage and steel. The Sultan sensed it before he named it. The land had changed its pulse. The hoofbeats began to echo differently, not because the path widened, but because stone remembered every footstep of war. Esposa sat upright despite the sway of the saddle, her gaze fixed ahead, her hands steady, her fear kept behind a veil of discipline. Yet she could not pretend, could she, that her heart had not begun to argue with her mind. The Sultan told her it was time to separate, and the words landed like a blade placed gently against the throat, not cutting yet, but deciding where the wound would be. He did not say it cruelly. He said it the way a commander speaks when fate demands division, when one thread must be pulled while another must be held tight. He warned her to remain careful, to guard herself as if her life were a key that unlocked a door for everyone else. Esposa, who had learned long ago to hide her feelings in the deep pockets of silence, tried to answer with the strength he expected. But the night had already changed them. Because the more she rode beside him, the more she recognized something she had never allowed herself to believe. How close two hearts can become without losing their distance. How loyalty can feel like tenderness when the world around you is ready to tear tenderness apart. Esposa confessed, not in speeches, but in the way her breathing slowed and steadied under his presence. In that moment, the Sultan felt it too, that she was not merely a companion moving through darkness, but a living proof that fear could be conquered without swords. Their wounds, old, invisible, hidden beneath their histories, felt like they were speaking the same language now. The Sultan lifted his hand slightly, just to touch her for a heartbeat, as if to remind her that fear, when it vanishes, does not leave emptiness. It leaves space where courage can grow. And then, as the sea mist thickened and the path narrowed toward Gemalik's shadowed approaches, the separation became real. Horses veered, cloaks shifted. A single lantern's light swung between them like a compass needle trying to find north in a storm. The Sultan looked toward the route Esposa would take, his eyes tracing every cover of brush, every broken post, every patch of ground where an ambush might bloom. He believed in preparation more than luck, and yet even he understood that the enemy never fought fair. They fought like predators, always hungry, always patient. The moment Esposa slipped away into darker terrain, the Sultan truly felt, that the night around him had become denser. Not from fog alone, from intent. As the minutes passed, the fire far off grew stronger and the smoke thickened into a moving curtain. Through that curtain he heard faint sounds, too measured to be only animals, too rhythmic to be only wind. Steel against steel somewhere in the distance. A subtle shift of boots that tried to mimic casual walking but failed. The Sultan's hand moved toward his weapon with calm precision. His mind, trained to see battlefield patterns even in a moonless forest, began placing invisible lines on the ground. Here could be archers, there could be a flank, and if they struck now, they would try to shatter his momentum before it became an advantage. A horn did not blow. A signal was never announced when the enemy feared being noticed. Instead, arrows hissed out of the darkness in quick, testing bursts, stray and meant only to locate. Then came the real push. Figures emerging not in full bravery but in half-light confidence, knives and sabers held low to keep their shapes hidden until the last instant. Sultan's response was not a grand charge. It was a disciplined collapse of options. He turned his horse just enough so that the first line of attackers became trapped between his movement and a broken rise of land. The forest path narrowed, forcing them into close angles, and close angles are where experience wins. Then steel flashed, short, decisive arcs that ended a threat before it could grow. The Sultan's blade did not sing like a minstrel's instrument. It struck like judgment, each contact a statement. Step wrong and you do not get another chance. He moved like a man who had already imagined this exact night in his sleep. And when one attacker tried to flank, another tried to hide behind a burning torch's dying glow, the Sultan pivoted with brutal timing. He parried an incoming strike, felt the shock travel up his wrist, and used that moment, always that moment, to counter. Smoke curled around his shoulders. Firelight smeared across armor. His opponents fought with desperation now because the enemy had counted on confusion, and confusion had been denied to them. Still, the night refused to give him a clean victory. One commander, his voice disguised by distance and cloth, attempted to coordinate a withdrawal, drawing the Sultan forward toward an area where the ground was softer and the shadows deeper. A trap, not unlike those Yakid and others had once used elsewhere. Create an illusion of escape, then stab the escaping man from the sides. The Sultan did not fall for it. He feinted, just enough to coax the trap's trigger into revealing itself. Then he cut left into a narrower segment of the path, and there he found the intention behind the shadows. Two archers posted on a fallen trunk, their bows ready, their faces hidden but their discipline visible in the stillness of their hands. Steel and fire collided again. The Sultan reached them faster than they expected because his horse was not only a mount but a weapon, used with restraint. He struck one archer's bow hand first, not the body, so the second arrow would never fly. Then the blade followed through. The other archer tumbled, clutching at his weapon as if grief itself could keep his courage from collapsing. As the fight tightened, the forest seemed to inhale then exhale smoke in faster waves. Somewhere men shouted, somewhere another horn tried to replace the first horn, but the sound died in the thick air before it could fully travel. The enemy tried to scatter, but the Sultan's men, those who had been riding concealed in the folds of strategy, closed in from behind. Encirclement was their second language. They did not merely win duels, they made duels unnecessary by taking away escape routes. Then, with a silence that felt almost unnatural after the violence, the attackers broke, some into the brush, some toward the direction where the distant fires burned brighter. The Sultan stood amid the smoke for a heartbeat longer than pride would allow, listening to the last echoes. He did not need to see the enemy disappear to know where they would regroup. He could feel the pattern in the way they retreated. They weren't just fleeing. They were repositioning, waiting for the next moment the Sultan's attention would slip. And that moment would come because the realm was not only being fought on the ground, it was being fought in time. While Gemalik held its breath in smoke and steel, far away yet somehow close in fate, the forest had already witnessed other reckonings. Night had broken into restless stages, and by dawn the hunt would either end or worsen. In those earlier moments, when cages had burned and hands had wrestled with iron bars, Orhan Sahib had survived not because the world granted him mercy, but because people around him refused to surrender their loyalty to cruelty. Orhan still carried the weight of that survival. He was not a man who moved lightly. Even when he stood as if every step cost him something. The forest around him had become a battlefield of broken promises, smoke-laced air, scorched leaves, and the bitter smell of fear after violence. His companions had fought like kin, and the enemy had bled like men, which meant the world had shifted again toward justice. Yet victory does not end war, it only changes its form. After Difne's fall and the immediate chaos that followed, the remaining threats had not vanished. They simply learned to hide better. As the dawn began to thin the darkest shadows, Orhan could feel the pulse of a larger campaign approaching, distant and massive, like thunder rolling across seas. He heard riders too far away to be casual. He saw scouts moving with purposeful speed. And though no trumpet announced it, he understood. The enemy's patience had shifted from local revenge to grand strategy. So his mind returned to what commanders always knew and survivors sometimes forgot. Survival is not only about escaping blades. It is about refusing to be placed where the enemy wants you to be. And if they wanted him trapped between two converging armies to be swallowed by geography and timing, then he would fight not only with steel but with direction. That is when Tarhan arrived, not with a dramatized entrance but with the quiet inevitability of a man used to moving through chaos. Tarhan's eyes were sharp despite the smoke that clung to his cloak, and when he spoke it was not to entertain fear but to organize it. He brought news wrapped in urgency. The enemy's fleet was preparing. Their commanders weren't only hunting Orhan now. They were building an entire net from the sea to the hills, from the shore's reach to the mountains' choke points. Faladios, too, had left marks in the dark, whether through betrayal, intimidation, or simply the cunning chaos of war. Orhan sensed it in the way some faces avoided direct eye contact, in the way some paths had too conveniently cleared under night's cover. False certainty often rides alongside real danger. Then the hunt brought them closer to what remained of Yakid's shadow. Not long before, Yakid had tried to slip away from justice, thinking his words and his hidden violence could still reassemble control. But in the end, when surrounded, he had been forced to choose between surrender and annihilation. The Sultan, driven by the same fierce logic that once made a ruler into a legend, had cut through hesitation. Steel had found flesh. The forest had swallowed the last scream into the soil. And though blood stained the ground, the deeper wound was psychological. The enemy's belief that treachery guarantees survival had been burned away like oil fire. Still, the war did not care about individuals as much as it cared about outcomes. Yakid's death meant the local engine of betrayal had seized, but larger engines still roared elsewhere. And that elsewhere was now calling for every commander's attention. At Bursa's palace, under lamps where light fought the edges of darkness, Nilofer stood in deep thought. The room around her was not empty, it was heavy with silence that felt like a second wall. Her mind traveled through her own past with a careful cruelty, measuring every decision that had brought her to this place. She had been entrusted with the idea of being priceless, the idea that her existence could become a key to peace, or a spark to ignite chaos. She knew the difference between being valued and being controlled, and she feared that perhaps she had once been used as if love were only another tool. Then her mother, Malin Khatun, approached with the calm authority of a woman who understood that emotion can be managed but fate cannot be negotiated. She placed reassurance where doubt used to live. It was not soft comfort, it was disciplined certainty. Malin Khatun reminded Nilofer that she had been troubled too long by the Sultan's heart and Orhan's gaze, by the way eyes can become obligations and silence can become fate. Now the task was clearer. Orhan's most precious possession, whatever it meant in truth, whether it was a trust, a symbol, or a promise that could alter the realm's future, had been entrusted to her protection. Nilofer's fear rose at once, as honest as it was inconvenient. She was ready to give her life, yes, but she feared the one thing that every devoted person fears, that her loyalty could unintentionally injure the thing she vowed to safeguard. Malin Khatun told her to breathe through that fear. She reminded her that panic is a thief, and courage is the only coin that can buy time. What mattered now was not Nilofer's emotions alone, but her role as guardian of the realm's trust. She had to accept everything tied to the state's safety, the records, the decisions, the burdens that others might pretend not to see. In her hands, the message became not paper but purpose. The seal of the letter carried weight. Within it lived years of careful planning, lines written in ink that had traveled farther than a courier could run. Nilofer read it as if each word were an instruction to her blood. All else, resentment, anger, the old hunger for revenge, fell behind it. The mission was more sacred than her personal wounds now. And as she vowed to protect her realm with renewed resolve, the palace felt like it shifted, like a chessboard had turned and the next move had been confirmed. Then, as the day's first light struggled against smoke's lingering memory, the war councils turned their attention to the sea. In the shadowed cathedral of Sidaria, under arches carved to endure storms and prayers, Shahanshah waited with heavy patience. His presence was not theatrical, it was concentrated pressure. Around him stood Andriaz and Shahanshah, men whose ambitions were as vast as the horizon, men who spoke as if their words could bend weather. The urgency in Shahanshah's voice carried through the hall like wind through cracked windows. He summoned them because there was no longer time for hesitation. The realm could not afford delay. The enemy's movements had become too synchronized, too informed. They waited for a single report, the one they had been guarding in hope and fear, and now it had arrived. Their fortress of strategy was built on three truths. The season would decide speed, surprise would decide survival, and terrain would decide which army died and which one lived to fight again. Ndreas explained it with the clarity of a veteran who had learned that mercy is a luxury only the victorious can afford. He spoke of Ottoman targets, not as generic enemies, but as roaming elements that needed to be crushed while they still believed themselves safe. Then Shahanshah leaned into the map, pointing beyond the obvious. He spoke of weathered mountains where the Turks would retreat in spring's approach, holding their clans in stubborn footholds. The best moment to strike was not when the enemy was already ready, but when the enemy was pretending readiness while their defenses remained stretched thin by the demands of relocation. Attack their instability, he implied. Capture their vulnerability before it hardens into a fortress. Shahanshah spoke of bombardments and destruction without theatrical flourish, only the grim arithmetic of war. He planned a coordinated approach from the sea's edge to the heights, a dual pressure that would split attention. One division would strike in a manner designed to shatter supply routes. Another would force the enemy's commanders into a choice between protecting their front or saving their flank. In the middle of it all, the ambitious design waited. Orhan would be pressed like a wedge between forces, trapped in the gap where destiny could turn into slaughter. The thought felt like poison in the air. For Orhan, whether he knew it or not at that exact moment, had become a symbol around which other men were planning their victory and their doom. That is how history works when it becomes a weapon. It turns living people into pieces on a board. Orhan had always fought to break the board's cruelty. But if his enemies believed they had already calculated his fate, then the next move would determine whether their calculations remained accurate or became a fatal joke. A name rose repeatedly among the commanders, like a drumbeat: Damir Khan and his authority over a fleet of fierce ships. Their vessels would sweep toward the enemy, making the sea itself a battlefield. The plan was not only to fight, it was to erase rafts, erase safe routes, erase the enemy's confidence that their maritime lifeline could continue uninterrupted. The strategy included burning and destroying their ships before they could be used as bridges for invasion. In the hall, swords were drawn, not for show, but for conviction. Then the great shift began to feel real. Maps became motion. Words became commands. And outside, somewhere beyond cathedral walls and palace lamps, fleets cut through darkness, their sails catching moonlight like pale wounds. 3 large ships waited on the sea, and upon one of them stood Sultan Aladdin and Kara Kalo, men whose ambitions had always been larger than their sleep. Their conversation was less about fear than about timing. Their scouts and wandering dervishes had fed them information. Now that knowledge became action. They would pass through what the enemy considered choke points, moving like water finding cracks in stone. Aladdin asked with strategic urgency whether the enemy's route was truly understood. The answer came: the enemy would force their way through Bosporus by relying on breadth and movement, then advance toward the mountain's weakness, using spring's shifting winds as cover. Then came the harsh promise: capture and cut off the route, conquer the hills that overlook the road, and burn what must be burned before it can be used again. Their opponents would try to appear in numbers and intimidate with size. But intimidation is a fragile weapon against disciplined coordination. Turan, another commander of sea-born determination, sharpened the vow into something almost religious in its intensity. He asked whether they would choose glory through victory or sacrifice through martyrdom. The Sultan's answer was the kind that made men feel both small and fearless. He declared that the victory belonged to Allah alone, and the swords in hands became not only weapons but prayers, held high as if to persuade the world itself. The hall echoed with the repeated phrase of certainty, an oath spoken not once but again and again, as if repetition could turn fate into agreement. No conqueror exists besides Allah. Firelight flickered against steel edges, making every blade look like it carried its own dawn. And meanwhile, on another coastline, closer to uncertainty, Shahanshah's worry thickened in the Sidaria fortress itself. Under shadows that clung to stone like guilt, he stood troubled, his mind walking back through old events as if the past were a rope he could pull to change the present. Andriaz approached him with news that tasted of delay. "A little remains," he said, as if war always left fractions unfinished. Shahanshah considered what he wanted, not merely a throne but an empire where his choices could finally be permanent. He remembered hunting trips in older days with Ottoman leaders, the way certain men had always moved together and certain others had never been allowed the same privilege. There had been something deliberate in that exclusion. There had been suspicion in the history of who was permitted to join the hunt and who was kept away like a dangerous secret. He spoke of a place the name itself carried hardship, an area where life was difficult, where travel punished the impatient. They believed it was a suitable hunting ground, and rumor had carried the rest. The Ottoman leader had once prepared to go, and someone, the man whose name now haunted Shahanshah's ambitions, had wanted to come too. But the invitation had been denied. Instead, the Ottoman leader and the others had departed, and then disaster had struck. Storms, rain, the kind of chaos that ruins plans and reveals who truly understands survival. Some returned, some didn't, and when they returned, Arhan was missing. Shahanshah's fear was not that Arhan was dead. His fear was worse, that Arhan was alive, trapped, hidden, and waiting for the exact moment when rescue would be least expected and vengeance would be most useful. A living enemy is never only a threat. Sometimes a living enemy is a question, a riddle, a future problem that forces you to plan even when you want to rest. A soldier announced the opening of a gate, and the fortress's tension tightened as if a fist had closed around the throat of time. Then they arrived, Sultan and Esposa, riding not as triumphant heroes but as men and women returning from a night that had tried to break them. Their faces were set, their movements controlled, yet behind the control the world could still see the strain. When Sultan spoke again when he announced they were close to Gemlik and now the time to separate had come, Esposa's worry was immediate, not performative. She told him to remain careful, to be cautious as if caution were armor. And the Sultan replied with the kind of certainty that only grows from shared danger. He reminded her that she was different now than she had been before, that she was not the person the world had tried to form for her at the beginning. And in that recognition, in that strange, intimate agreement between fate and loyalty, something tightened between them, not love as romance, but love as purpose, love as shared survival. They spoke of understanding each other's hearts, of the strange feeling that when fear vanishes, closeness becomes unavoidable. The Sultan held her hand briefly, an unspoken promise that even separation could not undo their bond. And as the episode drew toward its end in that earlier moment, the world, having taken its breath, prepared to continue. Because outside the fortress, the night was still alive with smoke and strategy, and somewhere the enemy's scouts would be reporting. Somewhere Faladios would be watching for the slightest mistake. Somewhere Turhan would be choosing whether to commit too early or strike too late. And somewhere, always somewhere, Arhan Saheb would be dragged between decisions, between the weight of wounds and the sharpness of hope. The Sultan's separation from Esposa did not mean distance in spirit. It meant division of labor, division of influence, division of risk. And as Esposa vanished into darker routes toward the next phase of protection, the Sultan moved toward his next confrontation as though he could already taste the coming battle, salt from the sea, iron from steel, and the bitter bite of fate pressing toward the dawn. Then the smoke thickened again, and the forest, whether seen from fortress walls or hidden in the ravines of strategy, became the same chessboard it had always been. A place where one wrong step could turn victory into blood, where loyalty could either be rewarded or brutally tested, and where history never ended, only advanced, scene by scene, into the next night's fire. The flames roared higher around the iron cage, their orange tongues licking at the wooden beams of the chamber as if the very night itself had been set ablaze by hatred. Inside that cage, Ebrenos held Fatima close to him, shielding her from the searing heat with the last strength left in his body, his arms trembling not from fear but from the unbearable helplessness of watching the woman he loved suffocate in smoke. And outside, beyond the bars, Orhan Sahib stood like a mountain carved out of fury, the heavy iron hammer gripped in both his hands, sweat pouring down his face, his eyes red from the smoke and redder still from the rage that burned hotter than any fire around him. He raised the hammer high above his head, and with a roar that tore through the night, he brought it down upon the lock of the cage. Sparks flew. The iron screamed. He struck again, and again, and again. Each blow was not just metal against metal, it was the sound of a brother refusing to let his blood die, the sound of a sultan refusing to bow before the schemes of traitors, the sound of a man who had walked through fire too many times to be stopped by it now. The beams above them groaned, threatening to collapse, and still Orhan struck. His shoulders burned, his palms split open against the wooden handle, but his rhythm never broke. He was no longer a sultan in that moment, he was a hammer himself, a forcible hammering against the gates of death. And then at last, with one final, thunderous blow, the lock shattered and the cage door swung open with a violent crash. Smoke poured in. Ebrenos lifted his cloak and wrapped it around Fatima's shoulders, covering her face, his hand cradling the back of her head as if she were the most fragile thing in the world. He guided her forward, and Orhan reached in, pulling them both out into the open courtyard where the cool night air struck their lungs like mercy itself. Fatima staggered forward, coughing, her eyes searching through the haze, and the moment she saw Halima standing there waiting for her, she let out a sound that was half a sob and half a prayer, and the two women collapsed into each other's arms. Halima held her sister tighter than she had ever held anyone, whispering into her hair, asking again and again if she was hurt, if she was burned, if she was whole. And Fatima could only nod, because words had abandoned her, because the relief of being alive was too vast to be spoken. The others gathered around them, faces blackened by soot, eyes shining with tears that none of them tried to hide, and Esporcha stepped forward, her voice steady but laced with quiet triumph as she turned to Ebrenos and told him that by escaping this fire, he had also escaped the chains of suspicion that had been wrapped around his name for so long. Ebrenos turned slowly, his brow furrowed, the firelight dancing across his exhausted face, and he asked her what she meant. And Esporcha, with the calm certainty of one who had unraveled a long and bitter knot, told him that Anastasia was the daughter of Andreas, that the entire web of lies and treachery had been spun by Daphne, that the woman he had been blamed for was nothing more than a pawn in a larger, darker game. Ebrenos closed his eyes and let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for months, a breath heavy with the weight of every wrongful glance, every whispered accusation, every silent burden he had carried alone. And Fatima, still trembling in Halima's arms, lifted her head and her voice came out low and sharp like a blade drawn from its sheath. "Daphne," she said, "deserves to die by my hands." Orhan stepped forward, his hammer still hanging at his side, and he told her that the time had finally come, that the hour of reckoning was upon them. Shamal, standing nearby with his sword already unsheathed, nodded grimly and said that these traitors had lived far longer than they deserved, that their rightful place was the cold, dark earth beneath their feet. Orhan looked out into the trees beyond the burning compound, his eyes narrowing, and he gave the order. They would scatter through the forest, they would hunt them down, every last one of them, and from this night forward not one of these snakes would ever again sink its fangs into the flesh of the innocent. And with that, the company moved, swords drawn, torches raised, vanishing into the black canopy of the woods where the real hunt was only just beginning. The night bled slowly into the pale gray of dawn, and as the first thin light crept between the trunks of the trees, we find Darsan lying motionless upon the cold earth, his body twisted at the base of a great oak, his horse standing faithfully beside him with its head bowed low as if mourning. His companions, who had been searching for him through the long hours of darkness, finally caught sight of his fallen form, and they came running, their boots pounding against the wet ground, their voices breaking with desperation. Mustafa was the first to reach him, dropping to his knees beside his brother in arms, his hands trembling as he pressed his fingers to Darsan's throat, his ears straining for any sign of life. And then his face lit up with a flash of disbelieving joy, and he cried out that Darsan was alive, that he was still breathing, that they had to move quickly. He shouted for the horses to be brought forward, his voice raw with urgency. He tore a strip of cloth from his own tunic and pressed it hard against the wound, leaning his weight upon it to stop the bleeding, whispering to his fallen brother to hold on, to endure, to not slip away now after surviving so long. The soldiers ran, their feet flying, every second a hammer against their hearts. And while this drama of survival played out in one corner of the forest, in another corner an altogether different hunt was unfolding. Daphne was running. Her dress was torn at the hem, her hair tangled with leaves and twigs, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she stumbled between the trees, her hand pressed against her side where the long flight had begun to drive a knife of exhaustion into her ribs. She glanced over her shoulder again and again, her eyes wide with the terror of the hunted, and then she ducked behind the thick trunk of an old tree, pressing her back against it, trying to slow her breathing, trying to disappear. But behind her, moving like wolves through the undergrowth, came Halima, Fatima, and Esporcha, their faces set in stone, their eyes scanning every footprint, every broken twig, every disturbed leaf. Halima knelt down, brushed her fingers across the soft earth, and lifted her gaze to her companions. The tracks, she whispered, were fresh. The prey was close. She gave the signal, and the three women fanned out, moving in silence, weaving between the trees like shadows. Halima moved straight ahead, her jaw clenched, her grip tightening on her blade, and through her teeth she muttered a vow that she would kill her, that this would end today. Daphne heard the footsteps approaching, and she stepped out from behind the tree with a snarl of defiance, her own blade flashing in the morning light, her voice spitting curses to the heavens. She lunged at Halima, the blade arcing wickedly through the air, but Halima was faster, twisting back with the agility of a born warrior, the steel hissing past her cheek by a hair's breadth. In her effort to dodge, Halima lost her footing on the uneven ground and fell hard onto her back, the breath knocked out of her lungs. Daphne saw her advantage, and her face split into a grin of pure venom. She stepped forward, raising her weapon, and she told Halima that she would die, that she would tear that beautiful face apart, that she would carve her into pieces. But before that blade could fall, a dagger spun through the air with a sound like a whisper of judgment and buried itself deep into Daphne's body. She gasped, her eyes wide, her weapon slipping from her fingers, and she staggered backward and collapsed against the trunk of the tree. Esporcha lowered her arms slowly, her face cold as winter. Fatima rushed forward and helped Halima to her feet, brushing the dirt from her shoulders, asking if she was hurt, and Halima, breathing hard, told her she was unharmed. Daphne dragged herself up against the bark of the tree, leaving a smear of red behind her, and from her bleeding mouth she began to laugh, a broken, rasping laugh that turned into a cough. She lifted her eyes to Esporcha and told her that she thought she had won, didn't she? She told her that she had whispered things into her sister's ear, things that could never be forgotten, things that would poison Nilufer's heart against her until the end of time. She told her that she would live the rest of her days as the second woman, nothing more than a shadow walking beside Nilufer, never the sun, only the shade. Sporch's eyes flashed with fire, and she took a step forward, her hand already on the hilt of another blade. But Fatima caught her arm and held her back, telling her softly that this creature was not worth it, that she should let her go, that her death was already crawling toward her. Daphne turned her dying gaze toward Fatima, and her smile turned crueler still. "In you," she rasped, "I opened a wound in you that will never heal. On the day of your wedding, before your entire family, I shamed you. Tell me, Fatima, will you ever again be able to stand under a marriage veil without your hands trembling? Will you ever again hear the music of a wedding without hearing my laughter in it?" Halima stepped forward, her voice like iron. "Be silent," she said. "You are dying, and still you spit your poison like a serpent in its last breath." Daphne coughed again, a wet, terrible sound, and she laughed once more, weaker this time. "Halima," she whispered, "you have no mind, you only have rage. And rage will burn you to ash. You will never become the wife of a chieftain. Darsan will never be yours." And as those words left her mouth, her body went slack, her head fell forward, and the life drained out of her like water through cupped hands. Fatima stood over her for a long moment, looking down at the woman who had haunted them for so long, and she spoke quietly, almost as a final benediction. "You forced us to carry so many sorrows," she said, "but you will never again give pain to anyone. You have met your end, Daphne." The wind moved through the trees, the leaves shivered, and the forest seemed to exhale. And then the scene shifts, and in another part of that same vast woodland, Yakid was running. His cloak was torn, his sword was still in his hand, but his hand was shaking, and his eyes darted from tree to tree like the eyes of a man who knows the executioner is one step behind him. Behind him came Ebrenos, moving with the silent fury of a wolf that has been wounded too many times by the same enemy. Yakid crashed through the undergrowth, his lungs burning, his mind racing for any path of escape, any crack in the wall closing in around him. And then he burst into a clearing and his blood went cold because standing there in front of him blocking his path was Arhan Sahib himself, calm as stone, eyes like steel, his presence alone enough to stop a man's heart. There is nowhere left for you to run, Yakid, Arhan told him quietly. Drop your sword to the ground. From every side, riders and warriors emerged from between the trees, their blades catching the morning light. Yakid was surrounded. Shamal stepped forward and told him that if he had to die, he should at least die with some shred of dignity, that he should not make his final moments a thing of cowardice. And from the other side, Fatima, Esporcha, and Halima entered the clearing, the blood of Daphne still warm on their hands, their faces unmoved. Yakid looked around him at every face, at every blade, and he saw at last that there was no path forward and no path back. With a trembling hand, he let his sword fall to the earth. Shamal moved forward to collect the weapon, and Fatima's voice rose, sharp and clear. The Daphne with whom you wove your evil is dead, Yakid, she said. There is no one left to save you. You schemed and you plotted and you wore 1,000 masks of treachery, and still you failed to tear us apart. You lost, Yakid. Accept it. Ebrenos added that he would never again deceive another soul, that his days of betrayal were over. And Arhan stepped forward, his voice low and certain. Indeed, he said, he will deceive no one again. You and your father, he told Yakid, were devoured by your own greed. You thought you would kill Arhan and become the Sultan of Bursa. You truly believed it. And as the last word left his lips, he struck Yakid across the face with the back of his hand, a blow so sudden and so heavy that the traitor crashed to the ground. Arhan drew his sword and held its point at Yakid's throat, looking down at him with the cold pity of a man who has seen too many like him fall. But there is one thing you forgot, he said. Evil must always meet defeat. Yakid, his lip bleeding, his pride breaking, sneered up at him and asked who he thought he was to speak of good, who he thought he was, who never considered anyone but himself, who had ridden over 100 lives in his pursuit of power and now spoke of righteousness. Arhan looked down at him for a long moment, and then he said, I would take your life right here, but I will not stain my sword with the filth of your blood. Your blood is the blood of Ali Azel Jok, and so you will die by the rope, as befits your name. He turned to his soldiers and ordered them to take him away. He turned his back and he began to walk. And in that instant, Yakid moved. From a hidden sheath beneath his sleeve, he drew a small, wicked blade and he lunged upward with the last desperate strength of a cornered animal. The cry went up from every throat in the clearing. Sultan Arhan. Arhan turned, faster than thought, faster than fate itself, and caught Yakid's arm. With one terrible motion, he drove the hidden blade back into the body of the man who had brought it. He pressed down with the full weight of his fury, his teeth clenched, his eyes burning, until at last Yakid's body went limp and he collapsed at his feet, his own weapon buried in his own chest. Fatima looked away for a moment, her face pale. Arhan stood over the corpse and spoke softly, almost gently, You have received your due, Yakid. The scene shifts once more, and now we are within the cool stone walls of the palace of Bursa, where Nilofer stands by a tall window, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze lost in some distant horizon that only she can see. The weight of her thoughts presses down on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. And then soft footsteps approach behind her, and Malhatan, mother of the Sultan, comes to stand beside her, her presence calm and steady as an old river. My child, she says, you have spent too many hours troubled by your place in the eyes and heart of Arhan. Look. The most precious thing my Arhan possesses, the thing he values more than his own life, he has placed into your hands. Nilofer turns to her and her voice trembles only slightly as she speaks. I am ready to give my life upon this path, she says. But Allah knows I am afraid, deeply afraid, that I may somehow wound the trust of my Sultan. Malhatan shakes her head gently. Be afraid, she tells her. Fear can make a person careful, but never forget the strength of your own heart. You are the guardian of the trust of this state. To ensure peace, you must accept everything that comes with this realm. Nilofer breathes deeply and her eyes clear. Mother, she says, all of that is in the past now. With this letter, with this day, jealousy, anger, resentment, all of it has been left behind. Malhatan's face softens with joy. And Nilofer continues, from now on I will work without rest to keep our state standing forever. We have much to do, mother, very much. And Malhatan draws her into her arms and holds her there, two women, 2 generations, bound by the same fire. Far away in the cold halls of the Basilica of Samandaria, three figures sit in conference under the high vaulted ceiling. The Shahanshah, Andreas, and the emperor himself. The emperor leans forward and speaks to Shahanshah, his voice low and urgent. The reason I have summoned you here in such haste, he says, is that we have no more time to lose. Shahanshah asks what the cause of this urgency is. The emperor glances at Andreas and then back. The news I have been awaiting from Constantinople has arrived, he says. My army is ready to march upon the Serbs. Andreas straightens and speaks. Your Excellency, he says, in that case our first target must be the nomadic tribes of the Ottomans. The emperor turns to him. Andreas, he says, you lived among the Turks once. You know them better than any of us. Andreas nods. The Turks, he says, moved to the highland pastures in the spring. While they are still settling into their summer camps, while their tents are not yet anchored, while their flocks are scattered, that is when they are weakest. To strike them then, to seize them in that moment of vulnerability, would be the perfect blow. The commander present nods in agreement. Andreas speaks the truth, he says. If we attack their highland camps before the heat of summer, we will deliver a wound to the Ottomans from which they will not easily recover. The emperor smiles thinly. While my army destroys their targets at Esdar, he says, we will launch a full assault from the coast of the fortress of Iznik. The fleet under the command of Demir Khan will strike them from the sea. Caught between two great armies, Orhan will find himself swallowed by the depths of hell itself. The scene cuts to the open sea, where three great warships cut through the dark blue waves, their sails taut against the wind. Upon the deck of the lead vessel stand Sultan Aladdin and Kara Kalo, the salt spray in their beards, their eyes fixed upon the horizon. According to the reports from our traveling dervishes and our spies, Aladdin says the enemy moves in great number. Shamal, standing beside them, breathes out heavily. Sultan, he says, their number is vast. Then do we know the route of their march? Aladdin asks. They will cross the Bosphorus by ship, comes the answer, and from this landing they will advance overland toward the Serbs. The Quran is opened, prayers are spoken, and the strategy is laid out. By taking the heights of Juljaha, they will hold the position that watches over the enemy's road. Sultan Orhan's voice rises with quiet certainty. We will establish our war camp upon that ground, he says. We will take the other hills, and from the heights that overlook the fortress of Iznik, we will give the emperor a welcome he will never forget. Their plan is to support their land army from the sea. But we will burn every one of their warships before they can leave the harbor of Karasi. Tarhan strikes his chest. Either martyrdom, he says, or victory. Sultan Orhan looks at his commanders, his brothers, his blood, and his voice is low and trembling with the weight of prophecy. My commanders, he says, my companions, this is one of the greatest battles these Serbs have ever beheld. We will become the swords of Allah, crying out that there is no victor but Allah. And every man on that deck raises his sword to the sky and the cry roars out across the waves. There is no victor but Allah. There is no victor but Allah. Back at the fortress of Samandaria, the Shahanshah paces in deep distress, his hands clasped behind his back. Andreas enters and approaches him. A little more, he says, only a little more, and you will have the throne and the empire you have always desired. The Shahanshah shakes his head slowly. I and Osman Saheb, he says, used to ride out to the hunt often. Orhan always wished to come with us, but his father seldom gave him permission. There is a place in our region called Kiziljakaya, a wild and treacherous land. We had heard it was rich with game. Osman Saheb said we should go, and Orhan begged to come along, but his father refused him. We took up our weapons and we rode out. But on the way a terrible storm fell upon us, rain and wind so fierce that we could go no farther. Osman and I turned back. But when we reached the camp, Orhan was not there. Andreas frowns. Where was he? He asks. Shahanshah's voice grows hollow. By evening, he says, he returned, carrying the game he had hunted in Kiziljakaya itself. Andreas's eyes widen. So then, he says. Then Shahanshah replies, do not underestimate Orhan Saheb. Andreas lays a hand on his shoulder. Shahanshah, he says, Orhan is the prey and we are the hunters. All will be well, do not fear. At that moment, from the high walls, a guard cries down that the gates must be opened, that a horsewoman approaches bearing a corpse. The gates groan open. And meanwhile, upon a small boat cutting across the bay, Sultan Orhan and a sporcha stand at the bow together. We have come close to Gemlik, he tells her. The time has come for us to part. The sporcha lowers her gaze, her voice quiet, troubled. Take care of yourself, she says. Be very, very careful. Orhan looks at her for a long moment. You were not like this before, he says, and she smiles faintly. No, she says, I was truly not like this. But beside you, I am learning a self I never knew existed. I am meeting an sporcha I had never met before. Orhan's voice softens. I know that sporcha well, he says. She turns to him in surprise. How, she asks. Because he tells her, you are like me. The more I know you, sporcha, the more I understand. For the first time, I am not trying to understand someone, I am simply seeing them, our wounds, our fears. He reaches out and takes her hand. Now our hearts beat the same rhythm, he says. Esporcha's eyes fill and her voice catches. I did not believe in this once, she says. Where I come from, people do not speak the words of their hearts, and I was the worst of them. I had learned to bury every feeling in the deepest place inside me. But now when I am beside you, every silent word locked inside my chest finds its tongue one by one. I am not used to this. And do you know what is strangest of all? I should be afraid, I know I should be afraid, but I feel no fear at all. Orhan looks at her and the morning light catches his face, and for a moment he is not a sultan, not a warrior, not a hammer of God. He is simply a man who has finally found a place to rest his weary soul. When a person's fear ends, he tells her quietly, they come closer to themselves. You and I, we ran from one another for so long, but now there is nowhere left to run. And as the boat carries them onward, and the wind fills the sail, and the sea opens before them like a road of beaten silver, he tightens his hand around hers, giving her courage, giving her himself, giving her the promise that whatever storms still wait beyond this horizon, they will face them together. And so, beneath the great quiet sky of dawn, with traitors fallen, with fires extinguished, with hearts at last unburdened, this chapter draws to its close. But the war is not over. The emperor is gathering his fleet. Andreas is laying his traps. The heights of Juljaha wait to be taken. And somewhere in the distance, the drums of the next great battle have already begun to beat. The boat cut through the morning mist like a silver blade through silk, its wake trailing behind it in a long, whispering line that dissolved into the still water. Upon its deck, Sultan Orhan stood at the bow with Esporcha beside him, their hands still intertwined, their fingers locked together with the quiet desperation of two people who had learned through blood and fire that nothing in this world was guaranteed, not even another sunrise. The wind caught the sail and filled it with a breath that seemed to come from God himself, and the vessel surged forward, carrying them toward the distant shore of Gemlik, where the hills rose like sleeping giants against the pale sky. Orhan did not speak for a long time. He simply stood there, his cloak billowing behind him, his jaw set, his eyes tracing the coastline as it grew larger with each passing moment. And in his mind, beneath the quiet surface of his expression, 1,000 thoughts moved like currents beneath still water, each one heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. He thought of the battles already fought, of the blood already spilled, of the friends he had buried and the enemies he had sent to their graves. He thought of Fatima and Ebranos, of Halima's fierce loyalty, of Shamal's steady blade, of the way Turhan had stood beside him when lesser men would have fled. He thought of Darsan lying broken on the forest floor, of Mustafa's desperate cries to bring the horses, of the long, terrible silence that had hung over them all before Mustafa's trembling voice had confirmed that Darsan still lived. He thought of Daphne's last laughter, of the venom still dripping from her lips even as death crept into her veins, of the way she had spoken of Nilüfer and Esporcha, with the cruel precision of a woman who had spent her entire life sharpening words into weapons. And he thought of Yakid, of the hidden blade, of the desperate lunge, of the moment he had driven that steel back into the chest of the traitor with his own hands. He had killed before, many times. On the battlefield in the heat of combat, when adrenaline burned through his veins and the world narrowed to the space between two blades, he had taken lives without hesitation. But this was different. This had been close, intimate, the sound of Yakid's breath against his cheek, the feel of the blade sinking through cloth and flesh, the look in the traitor's eyes as the light began to fade from them. He could still feel it. He could still feel the warmth of that blood on his hands, and though he had washed them in the stream before they boarded the boat, he could not wash away the memory. Esporcha, standing beside him, seemed to sense the storm inside him, because she tightened her grip on his hand and turned her face slightly toward him, though she did not speak. She had learned in her time beside this man that there were moments when silence was more precious than any words, that the greatest gift she could offer was simply to be present, to be steady, to be the one fixed point around which his turbulent thoughts could orbit. And so she stood there, the wind threading through her dark hair, her eyes watching the same horizon, her heart beating in time with his. The shore drew closer, the details of the land sharpened. They could see the white walls of the port town, the masts of fishing boats bobbing in the harbor, the distant smoke rising from cook fires as the town began to wake. And Orhan knew that the moment they set foot upon that ground, the peace of this morning would shatter, that the world of politics and war and duty would swallow them whole once more. But for now, for these last few moments of the crossing, he allowed himself to simply stand, to breathe, to hold the hand of the woman beside him and feel, however fleetingly, that he was not a sultan, not a warrior, not a commander of armies, but simply a man who had found someone worth protecting. The boat touched the wooden pier with a gentle thud, and the sound seemed to break the spell. Orhan released Esporcha's hand, though slowly, reluctantly, and turned to face the shore. A small group of his men had ridden ahead to secure the landing, and they stood at attention as their sultan stepped onto the dock. Orhan nodded to them, his face composed, his bearing regal once more, and he helped Esporcha down from the boat with a steadiness that betrayed nothing of the emotion that still churned beneath his surface. They mounted their horses in silence, and the small company set off along the coastal road that wound its way through olive groves and past small villages where women were already hanging laundry on lines between stone houses and children were chasing chickens through dusty yards. The normalcy of it struck Orhan with an unexpected force. These people had no idea what was happening in the corridors of power, no idea that armies were gathering, that the emperor was sharpening his claws, that the ground beneath their peaceful lives was beginning to tremble with the approach of war. And it was for them Orhan reminded himself that he fought, not for glory, not for a throne, not for the songs that poets would sing, but for the right of these people to hang their laundry in peace, to chase their chickens through their yards, to sleep at night without fear. They rode through the morning and into the afternoon, and as they drew closer to the camp where the rest of their forces had gathered, the landscape changed. The gentle olive groves gave way to rolling hills covered in wild grass, and the sound of the sea faded behind them, replaced by the distant clatter of arms and the low murmur of thousands of men going about the business of preparing for war. When they crested the final hill and looked down into the valley below, Orhan felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the one that came every time he saw his army spread out before him like a vast, living organism. Tents stretched across the valley floor in neat rows, their canvas walls snapping in the wind. Campfires sent thin columns of smoke spiraling upward into the sky. Horses stood in picket lines, their heads low, their tails flicking at flies. Men moved between the tents carrying supplies, sharpening weapons, repairing armor. Banners hung from the taller poles, the symbols of different commanders and units, their colors vivid against the muted tones of the landscape. And everywhere, there was the sound of steel being prepared for the work of death. Orhan pulled his horse to a halt at the crest of the hill and looked down at it all, and for a moment he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he commanded. These were not just soldiers. These were fathers and sons and brothers. These were men who had left their homes and their families to follow him into the unknown, trusting that he would lead them not to destruction but to glory, or at the very least to a cause worth dying for. The burden of that trust settled upon his shoulders like a physical thing, pressing down, reminding him that every decision he made from this point forward would be written in blood. Behind him, Esporcha watched his face and saw the shadows move across it, and she knew that the man beside her was already somewhere else, already deep in the calculations of war, already weighing lives against objectives, already preparing himself for what was to come. She felt a pang of something that was not quite sadness but was close to it, the recognition that the man she had come to love was never entirely hers, that he belonged to something larger, to a destiny that demanded more of him than any single person could ask. They descended the hill and entered the camp, and the response was immediate. Soldiers stopped what they were doing and turned to watch their sultan ride among them, and a murmur ran through the ranks like wind through a wheat field. Some called out his name. Others simply nodded, their eyes fierce with loyalty. Orhan acknowledged them with small gestures, a tilt of the head here, a raised hand there, but his mind was already moving forward, already reaching toward the next meeting, the next council, the next decision that would shape the fate of thousands. The command tent stood at the center of the camp, larger than the others, its entrance guarded by two of Orhan's most trusted men. Inside, Tarhan and Shamil were already waiting, bent over a large map that was spread across a wooden table, their fingers tracing routes and positions as they debated the best approach. When Orhan entered, both men straightened and stepped back, their faces serious. Shamil spoke first, his voice low and measured. "Sultan," he said, "the scouts we sent to the northern pass have returned. The enemy has indeed begun to move. 3 columns, each of several thousand men, are marching toward the highland pastures as Andreas predicted. Their supply trains are heavy, their pace slow. They will reach the base of the Juljaha hills within 4 days." Orhan nodded slowly, his eyes already on the map, his mind calculating distances and terrain and timing. "And their fleet?" he asked. Tarhan answered that the harbor at Karasi had been spotted with ships, at least 20 war galleys and a dozen transports, all being loaded with supplies and men. Demir Khan's fleet would sail within the week, carrying enough soldiers to reinforce the land army and enough provisions to sustain a siege. Then we have 4 days, Orhan said quietly. 4 days to reach Juljaha before they do. 4 days to establish our position on the heights and prepare the trap. He traced the route on the map with his finger, following the winding path from their current position through the valley and up into the mountains. The highland pastures lay in a broad basin surrounded by hills on 3 sides, accessible only through 2 narrow passes, one from the north and one from the east. Chinese letter, those passes, was to control the fate of anyone caught in the basin below. Shamal pointed to the eastern pass. This is the wider of the two, he said. It will be their primary route of advance. We should place our heaviest forces here, behind the ridgeline where they cannot be seen until they are already committed to the valley. And here, at the base of the pass, we can construct a barricade of felled trees and sharpened stakes, a killing ground where their vanguard will be trapped between our cavalry on the heights and our infantry blocking their retreat. Turhan spoke next. The northern pass is narrower but not impassable, he said. If they send a detachment through it, hoping to flank us, they will find a surprise waiting for them. I will take 500 men and position them in the rocks above the pass. We will let them enter, and when they are halfway through, we will collapse the hillside onto them with fire and boulders. No army can fight when the earth itself is falling upon their heads. Orhan listened to both plans, his eyes moving between the 2 routes, weighing the risks and advantages of each. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying the quiet certainty that had become his hallmark. We will do both, he said. Shamal will command the eastern pass, Turhan the northern, but we will add one more element. He placed his finger on the map at a point just west of the basin, where a narrow trail wound through dense forest. This path, he said, is known only to the shepherds and the goats. It is not on any military map, but I have ridden it myself, and I know that it emerges behind the enemy's supply train. If we place a small, elite force on this path, hidden in the trees, they can strike the supply train at the moment of battle, cutting off the enemy's food and ammunition, leaving them stranded in the basin with no way to sustain their fight. Shamal's eyes widened slightly. That is a bold move, Sultan, he said, but the path is treacherous. If they are discovered before they reach the supply train, they will be cut off with no possibility of retreat. That is why I will lead them myself, Orhan said. The silence that followed was thick with understanding, with fear, with the particular kind of dread that settles upon men when their leader announces that he intends to place himself in the most dangerous position on the battlefield. Turhan stepped forward immediately. Sultan, he said, this is not wise. If something happens to you, the entire army will collapse. The enemy knows this. They will throw everything they have at you. And that is exactly what I want, Orhan said calmly. While they are chasing me through the forest, Shamal's forces will seal the eastern pass. While they are trying to find a way through the northern pass, Turhan will have already destroyed their flanking column. And while their commanders are focused on the battle in the basin, my force will tear the heart out of their supply line. It is not just a battle, he said, his voice dropping lower, it is a dance. And we must lead every step. He looked at both of his commanders, and in his eyes they saw the fire that had burned since the day he first drew a sword, the fire that could not be extinguished by defeat or treachery or the long years of fighting. And they understood, as they had always understood, that there was no point in arguing, that this man would go where the danger was greatest, because that was simply who he was, because the Sultan of the Ottomans did not ask his men to face what he would not face himself. Then let us prepare, Shamal said, and Turhan nodded, and the 3 men bent over the map once more, planning Chinese letter of the assault with the meticulous care of men who knew that in war, the difference between victory and death often lay in a single misjudged step. The camp came alive with activity as the orders were passed down through the ranks. Scouts were dispatched to watch the enemy's advance. The smiths worked through the night, their hammers ringing like church bells in the darkness, reshaping dents in armor, sharpening the edges of blades that had been dulled by the last battle. The healers laid out their instruments and boiled water, and prepared the herbs and poultices that would be needed when the wounded began to pour in. Officers moved between the tents, checking provisions, counting arrows, ensuring that every man had enough food and water for a 3-day march. The horses were fed and watered and their hooves checked for stones, because a lame horse on the battlefield was a death sentence. And through all of this, Orhan moved like a ghost, appearing here and there among his men, sometimes stopping to speak a word of encouragement, sometimes simply standing in the firelight and watching, his face unreadable, his thoughts buried so deep that no one could have guessed what moved behind those dark eyes. He visited the healers and checked their supplies. He visited the horses and ran his hand along the neck of his own mount, a great black stallion named Karenlik that had carried him through a dozen battles and had never once stumbled. He visited the front lines of the camp and stood for a long time looking out into the darkness beyond, where the enemy lay somewhere in the shadows, waiting. It was in one of these moments of solitude that Esporcha found him. She came up behind him quietly, her footsteps muffled by the soft grass, and she stood beside him without speaking for several minutes. The stars were out, thousands of them, scattered across the sky like the jewels of a mad king, and the moon hung low on the horizon, half full, its light casting long silver shadows across the camp. "You are leaving tomorrow," she said at last. It was not a question. Orhan nodded. "At dawn," he said, "we march for the forest path. And you will be in the most dangerous place." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion that she was trying very hard to control. "I have watched you walk into danger before," she said, "but this time feels different. This time I am not watching from a distance. I am here, and it is harder." He turned to face her, and in the moonlight, her face was pale and beautiful and trembling with the effort of holding herself together. He reached out and took her face in his hands, his thumbs resting gently on her cheekbones, and he looked into her eyes with a tenderness that he showed to no one else, that he had never shown to anyone else in his entire life. "Esporcha," he said, and her name in his mouth was a prayer. "I am coming back. Do you hear me? I am coming back. I have walked through fire for you. I have broken cages and killed men and bled upon the ground, and I am still here, and I will still be here when this is over. You have my word." She closed her eyes, and a single tear escaped down her cheek, catching the moonlight like a tiny diamond. She reached up and placed her hands over his, holding them against her face, breathing in the warmth of his palms. "Your word," she whispered. "Then I will hold you to it." He leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead, gently, reverently, as if sealing a vow upon her skin. And they stood there like that for a long time, two souls bound together by a thread that no army could cut, no battle could break, no amount of distance could stretch to the point of snapping. When he finally pulled away, she straightened and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and the warrior in her returned. "Then go," she said, "and come back, that is all I ask." He smiled, a rare and fleeting thing, like sunlight through storm clouds, and he turned and walked back into the heart of the camp, where his commanders were waiting and his strategy lay spread out upon the table like the map of a future that had not yet been written. Dawn came cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that hung low over the hills like a vast gray blanket. The air smelled of wood smoke and wet earth and the particular metallic scent that comes before a storm. Orhan's strike force assembled in the pre-dawn darkness, 200 of his finest warriors, men who had been chosen not for their strength alone, but for their silence, their endurance, their ability to move through forest and rough terrain without being detected. They wore no metal that might catch the light and betray their position. Their weapons were wrapped in cloth to prevent them from ringing against each other. Their faces were darkened with ash from the campfires, and their eyes gleamed with the quiet intensity of men who knew that they were walking into the jaws of the enemy. Tarhan clasped Orhan's arm as he mounted Karanlik. "Be careful, brother," he said. And then more quietly so that only Orhan could hear, "Come back to us, we need you." Orhan held his gaze for a moment, and something passed between them that could not be put into words, the bond of men who had bled together, who had nearly died together, who had saved each other's lives more times than either could count. Then he turned his horse and led the strike force out of the camp and into the darkness, and within minutes they had vanished as completely as if the earth itself had swallowed them. Shammel watched them go, and then he turned to his own men. "Mount up," he said. "We march for the eastern pass. We have 3 days to reach it and prepare the ground. Every hour counts. Move." The army split into 3 rivers of steel and canvas, each flowing toward its designated position, each carrying with it the hopes and fears of thousands of men who placed their lives in the hands of the Sultan they served. The camp was left in the care of a small garrison, enough to protect the supplies and the wounded from the previous battle, but not enough to fight. It was a calculated risk, but Orhan had made his calculations, and he trusted them as he trusted his own sword. Through the forest they moved, the strike force, silent as shadows, picking their way along the narrow path that Orhan had described, a path so overgrown with vines and fallen branches that it was barely a path at all. The trees closed in around them, their canopy so thick that even the gray light of dawn could barely penetrate, and the world became a tunnel of green and brown and black. The only sounds were the soft thud of hooves on mossy earth, the occasional crack of a twig, the muted breathing of men and horses climbing steadily upward through the rugged terrain. Orhan led from the front, his eyes scanning the trail ahead, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Beside him rode one of his oldest companions, a grizzled warrior named Kemal who had fought beside him since the very first days of his rise. Kemal had not spoken much during the march, but now, as they paused at the crest of a ridge to catch their breath and look back at the column of men winding through the trees behind them, he leaned across and spoke. "Sultan," he said, "in all my years of fighting, I have never seen a plan as bold as this. You are placing yourself between the hammer and the anvil." Orhan looked at him. "That is where the work gets done," he said. Kemal smiled, a weathered, knowing smile. "May Allah watch over us all," he said. They pressed on. The path grew steeper, the trees grew larger, and the air grew colder as they climbed higher into the mountains. The storm that had been threatening since dawn finally broke and rain began to fall, at first in scattered drops that drummed against the leaves overhead, then in a steady, relentless downpour that turned the path into a river of mud and turned every man's cloak into a sodden weight upon his shoulders. But they did not stop. They could not stop. The enemy was moving, and if they did not reach the position behind the supply train before the battle began, the entire plan would collapse like a house built on sand. Hours passed. The rain continued. The forest grew denser, the path narrower, the ground steeper. Horses stumbled, men caught them, kept moving. Twice they had to dismount and lead the horses through stretches of trail where the ground was too treacherous to ride. Once a section of the path had been washed away by a small landslide triggered by the rain, and they had to pick their way along a narrow ledge of rock above a churning stream, their boots slipping, their hearts in their throats. But finally, as the gray afternoon light began to fade toward evening, Orhan raised his fist and the column came to a halt. They had reached the edge of the forest, and through the trees ahead they could see it. The enemy's supply train. Dozens of wagons, loaded with barrels of food and crates of ammunition and bales of hay for the horses, stretched along the road below them in a long, vulnerable line, guarded by perhaps 200 soldiers who huddled under makeshift shelters against the rain, their weapons resting against the wagons, their attention focused on staying dry rather than watching for danger. Orhan's eyes narrowed as he studied the position. The wagons were arranged in a column that followed the road as it wound through the valley floor. The guards were spaced at irregular intervals, some clustered in groups of 4 or 5 around small fires, others standing alone, their cloaks pulled tight against the rain. The road was bordered on one side by a steep hillside and on the other by a drop-off into a ravine. There was no way out. If the supply train were attacked, the guards would have nowhere to retreat, nowhere to spread out, nowhere to form a proper defensive line. They would be trapped in a corridor of death. He turned to Kemal and the other officers of his strike force. "We wait," he said quietly. "We wait until the battle begins in the basin. When they hear the fighting, when they send reinforcements to the front, that is when we strike. Every man has his target. Every man knows his role. There is to be no shouting, no war cries, no warning. We move through them like the wind moves through grass, and when it is done, we burn everything." The men nodded, their faces grim, their hands already moving to check their weapons one final time. They settled into the trees, dismounting, finding positions among the rocks and the undergrowth where they could see the road but remain invisible. The rain continued to fall, and they let it fall, soaking into their clothes, running down their faces because the rain was their ally tonight. It masked their sound, it blurred their outlines. It turned the world into a wash of gray and silver where shadows could hide. And as they waited, miles away to the east, Shamal's forces reached the pass and began the work of preparing the killing ground. Men labored in the rain, dragging felled trees across the narrow defile, sharpening stakes and driving them into the soft earth, constructing a barricade that would turn the pass into a funnel of destruction. Above the pass, on the ridgeline, archers positioned themselves among the rocks, their bowstrings wrapped in oilskin to keep them dry, their quivers filled with the fire-tipped arrows that would rain down upon the enemy when the signal was given. It was grueling work, done in darkness and rain, but the men worked with the silent efficiency of soldiers who understood what was at stake. And in the northern pass, Turhan's men were doing the same, positioning themselves among the boulders and the thick stands of pine that lined the narrow gorge, laying the charges of fire and the triggers that would bring the hillside crashing down upon any force foolish enough to enter. Turhan himself sat on a rock with his sword across his knees, watching the rain fall, his mind running through the sequence of events that would unfold when the enemy arrived. He had done this before. He had planned ambushes, sprung traps, turned the terrain itself into a weapon. But he knew that no plan survived contact with the enemy unchanged, that the difference between a perfect ambush and a disaster lay in the ability to adapt, to think, to act in the chaos of battle when plans were shredded and only instinct remained. The enemy arrived on the morning of the fourth day, as the scouts had predicted. 3 columns of soldiers, each several thousand strong, their banners hanging limp in the heavy air, their boots churning the muddy ground into a quagmire as they marched toward the highland pastures. The lead column entered the eastern pass first, their vanguard marching in tight formation, their shields up, their eyes scanning the slopes above them. But the slopes were empty, silent, and after the first cautious hour, the column relaxed and the pace quickened. Shamil watched from behind the ridgeline, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his breathing slow and controlled. Not yet, he told himself, not yet. Let them commit. Let them pour into the valley. Let the trap close around them like a fist. The first column cleared the pass and fanned out into the basin, their scouts fanning forward to secure the area. The second column followed, and then the third, until the entire valley floor was covered with the moving figures of soldiers, the white canvas of their supply tents, the dark shapes of their horses, the glint of steel catching what little light filtered through the clouds. The basin was full. The trap was set. And then, from the far side of the valley, the sound of horns, the signal, the battle had begun. Tarhan's men struck the northern column first. As the flanking force entered the narrow gorge, a tremendous roar went up from the hillside, and boulders the size of carts came tumbling down, crashing through the trees, crushing men and horses alike, turning the gorge into a canyon of screaming and dust and flying debris. Tarhan's archers loosed their fire-tipped arrows, and the pine trees along the gorge burst into flame, turning the passage into a wall of fire that cut the flanking column in two. Men screamed, horses bolted, and the organized advance dissolved into chaos as the Turkish soldiers fought not the enemy but the earth itself, dodging falling rocks, stumbling through smoke, trying to find a way out of a trap that closed tighter with every passing second. The enemy commander in the basin heard the sounds of disaster from the north and immediately ordered the bulk of his forces toward the gorge to rescue the trapped column, to restore the flanking maneuver. And that was exactly what Shamil had been waiting for. As the basin emptied and the enemy's attention turned north, Shamil gave the signal, and from every slope and every ridge, his archers rose and loosed a storm of arrows that darkened the sky. The arrows fell like rain, a second rain, a rain of steel and fire, and wherever they struck, men fell, and wherever men fell, others stumbled over them, and the organized army in the basin became a panicked mass of running, shouting, dying men. Shamil's infantry charged down the hillside, their swords drawn, their voices raised in a single terrifying cry that echoed off the walls of the basin and turned the air itself into a weapon. They hit the enemy line like a wave hitting a seawall, and the seawall broke. The enemy scattered, some running toward the eastern pass only to find the barricade waiting for them, a wall of sharpened stakes and felled trees that turned the pass into a slaughterhouse. Others ran toward the northern gorge, only to find it still burning, still raining boulders, still a corridor of hell. Others tried to fight to hold their ground, to form a line, but they were surrounded, outnumbered, demoralized, and one by one they fell. And in the forest behind the enemy's lines, Orhan sat on his horse in the rain and listened. He listened to the horns, to the shouts, to the clash of steel, to the distant roar of fire. He listened and he counted and he waited. And then when he judged the moment was right, when the enemy's attention was fully consumed by the catastrophe in the basin, he drew his sword, and its blade caught the faint light that filtered through the canopy, and he turned to his men. Now he said, they poured out of the forest like a river of shadows, 200 men moving in perfect silence, fanning out along the road, surrounding the supply train before the few remaining guards even knew they were there. The attack was brutally efficient. There was no need for battle cries, no need for warnings. The first guards fell before they could open their mouths to shout. The second line of guards fell before they could pick up their weapons. The drivers of the wagons were pulled from their seats and disarmed. Within minutes, the entire supply train was in Ottoman hands. And then Orhan gave the order and the wagons were set alight. The fire caught quickly, fed by the hay and the oil and the dry wood of the wagon beds, and within minutes the road was lit by a wall of flame that could be seen from miles away. The enemy's supplies, their food, their ammunition, their provisions for the coming siege, all of it burned. All of it turned to ash and smoke and the smell of destruction. Orhan sat on Karanlik and watched it burn, his face illuminated by the flames, his expression one of grim satisfaction. The trap had worked. The enemy was trapped in the basin, surrounded on 3 sides, their supply line destroyed, their flanking column shattered, their forces in disarray. It was not yet victory, but it was the beginning of the end. And then, from the darkness of the forest beyond the burning supply train, a sound, a single horn blown 3 times, Arhin's head snapped up. That was the enemy's signal. A reserve force, hidden in the trees, waiting for this exact moment. He turned to Kemal. How many? He asked. Kemal strained his eyes into the darkness. I cannot tell, he said, but the horn sounded from more than one place. It could be several hundred. Arhin's mind raced. His men were exposed on the road, their position illuminated by the burning wagons, perfect targets for an enemy archer. He had to move, had to get his men off the road and into cover before the reserve force launched its counterattack. He raised his sword and pointed toward the forest. Into the trees, he commanded, move now. His men obeyed, melting back into the darkness. But as they did, the first arrows came whistling out of the forest, embedding themselves in the trunks of trees, in the ground, in the bodies of men who were not fast enough. A cry went up from the darkness, and the reserve force surged forward, their swords catching the light of the fires, their faces twisted with the fury of men who had watched their entire supply line burn before their eyes. Arhin wheeled Karenlik around and met the first wave head-on, his sword rising and falling with the mechanical precision of a man who had fought so many battles that his body moved without conscious thought. Steel rang against steel, sparks flew, and the night erupted into a chaos of close combat where every man fought for his life in a space so narrow that there was barely room to swing a blade. Arhin cut down the first attacker, deflected the second, and drove his shoulder into the third, sending him sprawling backward into his companions. Kemal was beside him, his sword a blur, his voice rising above the din as he rallied the men around their sultan. The fight was fierce and desperate. The enemy had superior numbers, but Arhin's men had superior training, and in the confined space of the forest where the trees limited the enemy's ability to form ranks, the Ottomans held their ground. Blow after blow was exchanged, and the forest floor became slick with blood, and the air filled with the sounds of men fighting and dying in the darkness. And then from behind the enemy, a new sound. The thunder of hooves. Shamal, having crushed the forces in the basin, had ridden hard to reinforce Arhin, and his cavalry burst through the trees like a wall of iron, hitting the enemy's reserve force from behind with devastating force. The enemy line buckled, broke, and then shattered completely, and the surviving soldiers threw down their weapons and fled into the darkness, pursued by Ottoman riders who cut them down without mercy. And just like that, it was over. The basin was clear. The supply train was burning. The enemy's army was destroyed, scattered, broken beyond repair. Arhin sat on his horse in the center of the carnage, surrounded by the dead and the dying, his sword dripping with blood, his chest heaving with exertion, and he let out a breath that seemed to carry with it the weight of every battle he had ever fought. Shamal rode up beside him, his armor dented, his face streaked with sweat and grime. Sultan, he said, the enemy commander has been captured. He is being brought to you now. Arhin nodded. Bring him. The enemy commander was led forward, a middle-aged man with a gray beard and hollow eyes, his hands bound behind his back, his armor stripped away, his bearing broken. He looked up at Arhin and saw not the face of a monster but the face of a man, and something in that face made him lower his gaze. You have lost, Arhin said quietly. Your army is destroyed, your supplies are ash, your fleet will find no port to land at when it arrives. You have nothing left. The commander's jaw tightened. Then kill me, he said, and be done with it. Arhin looked at him for a long moment and then he shook his head. I will not kill you, he said. I will send you back to your emperor with a message. Tell him that the Ottomans are not the prey he thinks we are. Tell him that the mountains belong to us, the forests belong to us, the land belongs to us. Tell him that if he wants this throne, he will have to come and take it himself, and that when he does, he will find us waiting. The commander stared at him, unable to believe what he was hearing. You would let me go, he asked. I would, Arhin said, because your emperor needs to hear the truth from the mouth of a man who has seen the truth with his own eyes. Go, and do not come back. The commander was untied and given a horse, and he rode away into the darkness, and Arhin watched him go with eyes that were already thinking about the next battle, the next challenge, the next threat that would come from the direction of Constantinople, because he knew, as every sultan before him had known, that the fight was never truly over, that there was always another enemy, always another storm gathering on the horizon, and that the only choice a man had was to meet it standing. But the story does not end on the battlefield. For while Arhin and his men were securing their victory in the mountains, another scene was unfolding far to the south, in the quiet streets of a town where the war had not yet reached, where the sun still shone on stone walls and the sound of the muezzin still rose 5 times a day from the minaret of the old mosque, calling the faithful to prayer. Here, in a small house with a courtyard shaded by a fig tree, an old woman sat on a woven mat and waited. She was Darsan's mother, a widow who had raised her son alone after his father fell in a battle years before, a woman whose hands were rough from work and whose face was lined with the particular kind of grief that comes from loving someone who lives in constant danger. She had received word 3 days ago that her son had been found, that he was alive but badly wounded, that men were bringing him home. And so she waited, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the door, her heart beating with the slow, heavy rhythm of dread. When they finally came, she heard them before she saw them. The sound of horses on the road, the murmur of men's voices, the creak of a wagon. She rose to her feet with a speed that belied her age and went to the door, and she saw them coming up the road, a small procession of soldiers escorting a wagon on which her son lay, wrapped in bandages, his face pale as parchment, his breathing shallow but steady. She did not cry out. She did not run. She simply stood there, her hand on the doorframe, her eyes taking in every detail of her son's condition, and when the wagon stopped and the soldiers lifted him down and carried him inside, she followed, and she sat beside his bed, and she placed her hand on his forehead, and she began to pray. The soldiers told her what had happened, how he had been found in the forest, how Mustafa had saved his life with torn strips of cloth in desperate hands, how the Sultan himself had ordered that Darsan be brought home with honor. She listened to all of it without speaking, her hand never leaving her son's forehead, her lips moving in silent prayer, and when the soldiers had finished, she looked up at them with eyes that were bright with tears but steady with faith. Allah is merciful, she said, my son lives, that is enough. And in that small house, with the fig tree casting its shadow across the courtyard and the sound of the muezzin rising from the mosque, a mother kept watch over her son and prayed and waited for the dawn. Meanwhile, in the palace of Bursa, the news of the victory at Juljaha arrived like a thunderclap. Messengers on fresh horses rode through the gates bearing dispatches sealed with the Sultan's own stamp, and within hours, the palace was alive with activity. Officers rushed between chambers, messengers were dispatched to every corner of the realm, and the people of Bursa, who had been living under the shadow of fear for months, poured into the streets in celebration, their voices rising in song and prayer and the particular kind of joy that comes from the lifting of a great burden. Niloufar stood at the window of her chamber and watched the celebrations below, her hands clasped in front of her, her face illuminated by the warm light of the setting sun. Malhattan had told her the news herself, had taken her hands and looked into her eyes and said that her sultan had won, that the enemy was broken, that the realm was safe for now. And Niloufar had smiled, a real smile, the first in a long time, because she knew that what Malhattan had really been telling her was that the future she had feared, the future of war and loss and destruction, had been postponed, that there was still time, that there was still hope. She thought of the last time she had seen Arhan, at the harbor before he had boarded the ship, the way he had looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes, the way his hand had lingered on hers for just a moment longer than necessary, the way he had said nothing but had said everything in that single, silent touch. She had been afraid then, afraid of what he might become, afraid of what the war might do to him, afraid that the man she loved might be consumed by the sultan he was forced to be. But now, with the news of his victory, she felt something shift inside her. A settling of the waters, a recognition that the man she loved was not being consumed by his duty but was being forged by it, that the fire of battle was not destroying him but was making him stronger, sharper, more fully himself. She whispered a prayer of gratitude, and she turned from the window and went to the table where the household accounts were spread out, and she began to work, because the realm needed her as much as it needed the sultan, and she would not fail in her part. And in the quiet of the evening, as the last light of day faded and the stars began to appear, she heard footsteps in the corridor and a knock at her door, and when she opened it, a servant stood there with a sealed letter. She broke the seal and unfolded the parchment, and the handwriting was Arhan's, and the words were few. "The enemy is broken, the land is safe, I am coming home, wait for me." She read it 3 times, and then she pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes, and for the first time in a very long time she allowed herself to hope. And so the wheel of fate turned once more. The enemy was defeated, the traitors were dead, the realm was safe, and the hearts that had been torn apart by treachery and war were slowly, carefully, tentatively beginning to find their way back to one another. But the shadows were not gone. They would never be gone entirely because the world was vast and filled with men who hungered for power, and there would always be another threat, another betrayal, another storm gathering beyond the horizon. The emperor would not forget his defeat. Andreas would not stop scheming. The fleet at Karasi would sail again, carrying new armies, new ambitions, new destruction. But for now, in this moment, the night was quiet, and the fires burned low, and the men who had fought and bled and won lay down to rest with the knowledge that they had done what they could, that they had held the line, that they had protected what mattered. And somewhere in the distance, on a road that wound through olive groves and past small villages where women hung laundry and children chased chickens, a sultan rode homeward, his cloak dusty, his sword still sheathed, his heart heavy with the things he had done and light with the knowledge of what awaited him. He rode through the night, and the stars above him were bright, and the wind at his back was warm, and the road stretched on before him like a promise. And though he did not know it yet, though he could not see beyond the next hill or the next bend in the road, the greatest challenges of his life still lay ahead, the battles that would define him, the choices that would shape the destiny of nations, the moments when the line between triumph and tragedy would be as thin as the edge of a blade. But that is a story for another time. For now, the night is deep, the road is long, and the Sultan rides on, toward home, toward love, toward the future that waits for him like a door that has not yet been opened, standing at the threshold between what was and what will be, between the darkness of the past and the uncertain light of tomorrow. And so the curtain falls gently, slowly, like the wings of a great bird settling after a long flight, and the story pauses, breathing, waiting for the next chapter to begin. The fires still burn. The prayers still rise. The soldiers still keep watch. And the land, scarred and weary but unbroken, sleeps beneath a sky full of stars, dreaming of the peace that it has fought so hard to earn, and hoping, always hoping, that this time it will last. The flames roared higher around the iron cage, their orange tongues licking at the wooden beams of the chamber as if the very night itself had been set ablaze by hatred, as if every shadow in that cursed place had been given voice, and that voice was the crackling of burning timber, the hissing of embers, the desperate gasps of those trapped within. Inside that cage, Ebrenos held Fatima close to him, shielding her from the searing heat with the last strength left in his body, his arms trembling not from fear but from the unbearable helplessness of watching the woman he loved suffocate in smoke, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps against his chest, her fingers clutching at his tunic as if he were the only anchor left in a world that had become nothing but fire and ash. The iron bars around them glowed orange in places where the flames had kissed them, and the heat was so intense that Ebrenos could feel his skin beginning to blister, could smell the burning of his own hair where it had strayed too close to the gaps in the cage. And yet he did not move, did not flinch, did not loosen his grip on Fatima for even a single heartbeat. And outside, beyond the bars, beyond the wall of flame that separated salvation from damnation, Orhan Saheb stood like a mountain carved out of fury, the heavy iron hammer clutched in both his hands, his knuckles white against the worn wooden handle, sweat pouring down his face in rivulets that carved channels through the grime and soot and blood that stained his skin. His eyes were red from the smoke and redder still from the rage that burned hotter than any fire around him, a rage that had been building for months, for years, for a lifetime of watching the vipers of this world coil around the throats of those he loved. He raised the hammer high above his head, the muscles of his shoulders and back straining against the fabric of his tunic, and with a roar that tore through the night like the cry of a wounded lion, he brought it down upon the lock of the cage. Sparks flew, bright as fallen stars, and the iron screamed in protest. The sound echoed through the burning compound, through the corridors of memory, through the very bones of everyone who stood watching. He struck again, and the metal groaned. He struck again, and each blow was not merely the meeting of hammer and iron. It was the sound of a brother refusing to let his blood die in a cage like an animal, the sound of a sultan refusing to bow before the schemes of traitors who thought they could trap him in their webs of deceit, the sound of a man who had walked through fire too many times to be stopped by it now, who had lost too much, who had buried too many, who had sworn to himself in the darkness of too many sleepless nights that he would never again stand helpless while those he loved were taken from him. The beams above them groaned, threatening to collapse, their weight sagging inward as the flames devoured their foundations. And still Orhan struck, his breath coming in great heaving gusts, his arms burning with the strain, his palms split open against the rough wood of the handle, the blood from his hands mixing with the sweat and dripping down onto the heated iron where it sizzled and evaporated into nothing. He was no longer a sultan in that moment, no longer a ruler of men or a commander of armies. He was a hammer himself, a force of will hammering against the gates of death itself, a living embodiment of the refusal to surrender, the refusal to accept that this was where the story would end. And then at last, with one final thunderous blow that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth beneath their feet, the lock shattered. The sound was sharp and final, like the breaking of a chain that had bound a nation, and the cage door swung open with a violent crash that sent a shower of sparks spiraling into the night sky. Smoke poured out, thick and black and choking, and through that veil of darkness and ash, Ebrenos emerged, his cloak wrapped around Fatima's shoulders, his hand cradling the back of her head as if she were the most fragile thing in the world, as if she were a vessel of glass that might shatter at the slightest touch. He guided her forward, step by careful step, and Orhan reached in, his great hands closing around her arms, pulling them both out into the open courtyard where the cool night air struck their lungs like mercy itself, like the first breath of a man who has been dragged from the bottom of a dark sea. Fatima staggered forward, her legs weak beneath her lungs heaving as she coughed and choked and gasped, the smoke clearing from her throat in great hacking bursts that sounded more like sobs than breaths. Her eyes searched through the haze, through the tears that blurred her vision, and the moment she saw Halima standing there waiting for her, her arms outstretched, her face streaked with tears that she had not even bothered to wipe away, Fatima let out a sound that was half a sob and half a prayer, a sound of such pure, unguarded relief that it seemed to pierce the very fabric of the night itself. The two women collapsed into each other's arms, their bodies shaking, their fingers digging into each other's shoulders as if they needed to feel the solid reality of each other's presence to believe that this was real, that they were both alive, that the nightmare had not swallowed them whole. Halima held her sister tighter than she had ever held anyone, whispering into her hair, pressing her lips to her temple, asking again and again if she was hurt, if she was burned, if she was whole, her voice cracking with each question, her tears falling into Fatima's hair. And Fatima could only nod, could only press her face into Halima's shoulder and breathe in the familiar scent of her, the scent of home, of safety, of a love that had survived every storm that had tried to drown it. Words had abandoned her because the relief of being alive, the relief of being free, the relief of being held by a sister who had refused to give up on her even when the world had declared her lost, was too vast, too deep, too overwhelming to be shaped into language. The others gathered around them, their faces blackened by soot, their eyes shining with tears that none of them tried to hide, their hands reaching out to touch shoulders and arms and backs, grounding themselves in the miracle of survival. Halima's arms were still wrapped around Fatima when Esporcha stepped forward, her voice steady but laced with quiet triumph as she turned to Ebrenos and spoke words that would change everything he had believed about himself, about the accusation that had hung over his head like a sword, about the doubt that had poisoned the trust of those he loved. "You have escaped more than just this fire," she told him. "You have escaped the chains that were placed upon your name, the suspicions that have followed you like shadows, the whispers that have eaten at your honor." Ebrenos turned slowly, his brow furrowed, the firelight dancing across his exhausted face, his eyes hollow with the exhaustion of a man who has carried an invisible weight for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright without it. He asked her what she meant, and his voice was barely more than a whisper. Esporcha met his gaze with the calm certainty of one who had unraveled a long and bitter knot, who had traced every thread of the web back to its source, who had stared into the face of the weaver and had not flinched. She told him that Anastasia was not who they had believed her to be, that she was not a victim of his cruelty, that she was not a woman he had wronged, that the entire story had been a fabrication from beginning to end. She told him that Anastasia was the daughter of Andreas, the puppet of a conspiracy that had been plotted long before any of them had even heard her name. She told him that the web of lies and treachery had been spun by Daphne, that the woman whose shadow had darkened his life, whose accusation had driven a wedge between him and his sultan, between him and his honor, was nothing more than a pawn in a game that had been designed to destroy them all. Ebrenos closed his eyes, and for a long moment he did not move, did not speak. The firelight flickered across his face, caught the tears that had begun to gather at the corners of his closed lids, illuminated the trembling of his jaw as he let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for months, for years, for a lifetime of carrying a guilt that had never been his to bear. It was a breath of such profound release that it seemed to empty him of everything he had been carrying, and when he opened his eyes again, there was something different in them, something lighter, something that looked almost like peace. And Fatima, still trembling in her sister's arms, lifted her head. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face was smudged with ash, her hair was tangled and singed, but there was a fire in her gaze that had not been dimmed by the flames that had tried to consume her. Her voice came out low and sharp, like a blade drawn from its sheath, like the sound of a bowstring being pulled taut. Daphne, she said, deserves to die by my hands. She deserves to feel the same fear she has sown in the hearts of others. She deserves to know in her final moment that her poison has not killed us, that we are still standing, that we will be the ones to end her. Orhan stepped forward, his hammer still hanging at his side, his chest still heaving from the exertion of the rescue, but his voice was steady, certain, filled with the authority of a man who has made his decision and will not be swayed. The time has finally come, he said. The hour of reckoning is upon them. Shamal, standing nearby with his sword already unsheathed, its blade glinting in the firelight, nodded grimly and said that these traitors had lived far longer than they deserved, that every breath they had taken since their first betrayal was a breath stolen from the innocent, that their rightful place was not in the sunlight of the living world, but in the cold, dark earth beneath their feet, where they could no longer weave their webs, could no longer whisper their poisons, could no longer reach out with their corrupt hands to touch the lives of the pure. Orhan looked out into the trees beyond the burning compound, where the forest stretched away into the darkness like an endless sea of shadow and silence. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the tree line, as if he could see through the darkness itself, as if he could feel the presence of the hunted animals that were even now trying to vanish into the safety of the deep woods. He gave the order, his voice carrying across the clearing like the tolling of a bell. They would scatter through the forest, they would spread out like hunters driving game before them. They would leave no stone unturned, no shadow unsearched, no hollow log unexplored, and from this night forward not one of these snakes would ever again sink its fangs into the flesh of the innocent. This night would be the end of their reign of poison, and the beginning of something else, something that had been waiting in the wings of fate for far too long. And with that the company moved. Swords were drawn, torches were lit, and the hunters vanished into the black canopy of the woods, where the real hunt was only just beginning. The fire behind them continued to rage, casting their shadows long and distorted against the trees, making them look like giants, like specters, like the agents of a vengeance that had been earned in blood and suffering. The night bled slowly into the pale gray of dawn, the darkness retreating inch by inch as the first thin light crept between the trunks of the trees, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor like the fingers of the dead reaching up from their graves. The birds began to stir, their tentative calls breaking the silence that had held the woods in its grip through the long hours of darkness. And there, at the base of a great oak tree that had stood for centuries, that had seen empires rise and fall, that had witnessed the passing of countless generations, lay Darsan, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, his face pale and still, his hand still clutching the hilt of a sword that had been broken in two somewhere in the desperate fighting of the night before. His horse, that faithful beast that had carried him through 100 battles, that had been with him since he was a young man who still believed in the glory of war, stood beside him with its head bowed low, its great dark eyes fixed on its master's face, its breath coming in soft, mournful huffs that seemed almost like prayers. The horse had not moved from that spot since Darsan had fallen, had not grazed, had not sought water, had simply stood there, a silent sentinel keeping watch over the body of a man it refused to believe was gone. His companions had been searching for him through the long hours of darkness, their torches cutting through the blackness of the forest like desperate signals, their voices calling his name again and again until they were hoarse, their hearts growing heavier with each passing hour. They had found signs of the battle, broken branches and trampled earth and pools of blood that had dried to a dark, rust-colored stain, but they had not found him. They had begun to fear the worst, had begun to prepare themselves for the possibility that they would never see him again, that he had been taken by the enemy or by the wild animals that roamed these woods or by the simple mercilessness of a forest that did not care about the names or the loyalties of the men who bled into its soil. And then, as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the canopy, one of them saw him. His form was half hidden in the deep shadow at the base of the oak, but the horse standing over him gave him away, that faithful beast standing like a monument to loyalty. The cry went up from 5 throats at once, a cry of discovery and hope and fear all mixed together, and they came running, their boots pounding against the wet ground, their weapons forgotten at their sides, their only thought reaching him before it was too late. Mustafa was the first to reach him. He dropped to his knees beside his brother in arms, his knees sinking into the soft earth, his hands reaching out but hesitating, afraid to touch him, afraid to discover that the worst had already happened. He leaned forward, his face close to Darson's, his hand hovering over the still chest, and then he pressed his fingers to Darson's throat, searching for the pulse, for the beat of life, for any sign that he had not arrived too late. The seconds stretched into eternity. The forest held its breath. And then Mustafa's face transformed, the lines of grief and exhaustion melting away into a look of such pure, disbelieving joy that it seemed to light up the shadows around him. "He is alive," Mustafa cried, his voice cracking with emotion, with relief, with the sheer overwhelming gratitude of a man who had been granted a miracle. He is alive, bring the horses quickly, we need to move him, we need to get him back to the camp, we need to bind his wounds before he loses any more blood." Even as he spoke, he was already tearing a strip of cloth from his own tunic, pressing it firmly against the wound in Darson's side, applying pressure with the weight of his whole body, leaning over him, whispering to him, telling him to hold on, to endure, to not slip away now after surviving so long. "Barrett, brother, Barrett," he said, his voice low and fierce and desperate. "Barrett, I am here, I am with you, you are not alone, you are not going to die in this forest, do you hear me? You are not going to die, hold on, hold on, hold on." The soldiers who had scattered to find the horses returned at a run, leading the animals through the trees, their hooves thundering against the ground. And even as they approached, Mustafa was already lifting Darson's upper body, supporting his head, guiding him toward the horse, the others coming to help, their hands gentle despite their urgency, their voices low with encouragement and prayer. And as they lifted Darson onto the back of his own horse, that faithful beast finally raised its head, and it seemed to understand, seemed to know that its master was not lost, that there was still hope, that the bond between them had not been severed by the swords of their enemies. While this drama of survival played out in one corner of the forest, in another corner an altogether different hunt was unfolding. Daphne was running. She had been running for hours, her legs burning, her lungs screaming, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her dress was torn at the hem, caught on a dozen thorns and branches, the fine fabric now hanging in ragged strips. Her hair had come loose from its pins and was tangled with leaves and twigs, whipping across her face as she stumbled through the undergrowth. Her hand was pressed against her side, where a sharp pain had begun to grow with each step, a knife of exhaustion that was driving deeper into her flesh with every passing moment. She had been so certain, so arrogantly certain that her schemes would succeed. She had woven her web so carefully, so patiently, had planted seeds of doubt in the hearts of the strong and whispered poison in the ears of the weak. She had believed with the unshakable conviction of the truly arrogant that she was smarter than them, that she could outthink them, that she could use their own honor against them. But she had underestimated the one thing that had always been the undoing of schemers like her, the loyalty of those who loved each other. She had not understood, could not understand, that the bonds between these people were not made of convenience or ambition, but of something deeper, something that could not be broken by lies or threats or the promise of power. She glanced over her shoulder again and again, her eyes wide with the terror of the hunted, searching the darkness behind her for any sign of pursuit. And there in the distance she saw them, the torches moving through the trees like the eyes of demons, coming closer, always closer, relentless as the tide. She pushed herself harder, crashing through the undergrowth, ignoring the branches that scratched her arms and tore at her dress, ignoring the sharp stones that cut through the soles of her shoes. She ducked behind the thick trunk of an old oak, pressing her back against it, pressing her hand over her mouth to muffle her breathing, trying to disappear into the shadows, trying to become nothing more than another dark shape in a forest full of shadows. But behind her, moving like wolves through the undergrowth, came Halima, Fatima, and Asporcha, their faces set in stone, their eyes scanning every footprint, every broken twig, every disturbed leaf with the focused intensity of predators who have caught the scent of their prey and will not be distracted from their purpose. Halima knelt down, her knee pressing into the soft earth, and she brushed her fingers across the ground, tracing the shape of a footprint, feeling the freshness of the impression, the slight give of the soil that told her the foot that had made it had passed this way only moments ago. She lifted her gaze to her companions, her eyes gleaming with cold certainty. "The tracks are fresh," she whispered. "She is close." We spread out. The signal was given, and the three women fanned out, moving in silence, weaving between the trees like shadows, their footsteps light and certain, their hands never straying far from their weapons. Halima took the center path, moving straight toward the place where the tracks led, her jaw clenched so tight that the muscles in her neck stood out like cords, her grip on her blade so tight that her knuckles were white. Through her teeth, in a voice barely audible, she muttered a vow that she would kill her, that this creature who had caused so much pain would breathe no more, that this would end today here in this forest, with blood on the earth and peace in their hearts. Daphne heard the footsteps approaching. She heard the soft crunch of leaves, the whisper of fabric moving through air, the steady, relentless advance of the hunters. She knew she could not run anymore. Her body would not allow it. She stepped out from behind the tree with a snarl of defiance, her own blade flashing in the morning light as she drew it from its sheath, the steel catching the pale rays of the rising sun and throwing them back like a threat. Her voice was sharp and bitter as she spoke, spitting curses to the heavens, cursing the fate that had brought her to this moment, cursing the women who had pursued her, cursing every god and demon she could name for letting her fall to this. She lunged at Halima, her blade arcing wickedly through the air, aimed at the throat, at the face, at any part of her opponent that would bleed. But Halima was faster, her instincts honed by years of training and experience, by a lifetime of knowing that hesitation was death. She twisted back with the agility of a born warrior, the steel hissing past her cheek by a hair's breadth, so close that she could feel the wind of its passage, so close that a single strand of her hair was severed by the edge of the blade. In her effort to dodge, Halima lost her footing on the uneven ground, her heel catching on a root that snaked across the forest floor, and she fell hard onto her back, the breath knocked out of her lungs in a great whoosh of air. Daphne saw her advantage, and her face split into a grin of pure venom, a smile that was more like a snarl, a smile that held all the cruelty and spite that had defined her life. She stepped forward, raising her weapon high above her head, the morning light glinting off the blade, and she told Halima that she would die, that she would carve that beautiful face into ribbons, that she would send her to whatever gods she prayed to in pieces, that this was the end of the woman who had been so certain of her victory. But before that blade could fall, before the steel could taste the blood of the innocent, a dagger spun through the air with a sound like a whisper of judgment, like the sigh of a soul departing. It turned end over end, catching the light, and then it buried itself deep into Daphne's side, just below the ribs, in the soft flesh where there was no armor, no protection, nothing but the frail fabric of her dress and the fragile vessel of her body. The impact drove her backward, and she gasped, a sound of pure animal shock, her eyes going wide with disbelief, her weapon slipping from her fingers and clattering to the ground. She staggered backward, her hand going to the wound, her fingers coming away wet and red. She collapsed against the trunk of the tree, her legs giving way beneath her, her back sliding down the rough bark until she was sitting on the cold earth, her head falling back against the wood, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Esporcha lowered her arms slowly, her face cold as winter, her eyes holding no triumph, no satisfaction, only the grim satisfaction of a duty that had been waiting to be fulfilled. Fatima rushed forward, her feet carrying her across the clearing in a blur of motion, and she knelt beside Halima, helping her to her feet, brushing the dirt from her shoulders, her hands moving over her sister's body, checking for injuries, asking if she was hurt, if she was bleeding, if she needed help. Halima, breathing hard, her heart still pounding from the nearness of death, told her she was unharmed, that the dagger had found its mark before Daphne could find hers, that she was whole. Daphne dragged herself up against the bark of the tree, leaving a long smear of red behind her, the blood dark and thick against the pale wood. She drew a ragged breath, and from her bleeding mouth she began to laugh. It was a broken, rasping laugh, a hollow sound that seemed to come from some deep and empty place within her, and it turned into a cough that shook her whole body and left flecks of blood on her lips. She lifted her eyes to Esporcha, and her gaze was filled with a spite that even death could not dim. "You think you have won," she whispered, her voice thin and reedy. "You think this is your triumph." She told Esporcha that she had whispered things into her sister's ear, things that could never be forgotten, things that would fester and grow like a poison in the blood, things that would separate Esporcha from Nilüfer for the rest of their lives. She told her that she had planted seeds of doubt and resentment that would grow into walls between them, that she had poisoned the well of their love, that she had made sure that every time Esporcha looked at her sister, she would see a stranger. She told her that she would live the rest of her days as the second woman, the shadow, the echo, never the original, never the first, never the one who was truly loved. Nothing more than an outline beside Nilüfer, never the sun, only the shade that follows where the sun has already been. Esporcha's jaw tightened, her hand moved to her belt, reaching for another blade, her eyes blazing with a fury that could have burned down the forest around them. But Fatima caught her arm, her fingers closing around Esporcha's wrist, and she held her back with a gentle but unyielding grip. "No," Fatima said, her voice soft but firm, "she is not worth it. Let her go. Her death is already crawling toward her. Do not let her take you with her." Daphne turned her dying gaze toward Fatima, and her smile turned crueler still, a thin rictus of pure malice. In you, she rasped, her voice barely a whisper now, I opened a wound in you that will never close. On the day of your wedding, before your entire family, before the eyes of everyone you loved, I shamed you. I took your joy and I twisted it into something ugly. I made your happiness into a memory that you cannot revisit without feeling the sting of my laughter. Tell me, Fatima, will you ever again hear the music of a wedding without hearing my voice in it? Will you ever again stand under a marriage veil without your hands trembling, without seeing the faces of your family as they watched you be humiliated? Will you ever again know the sweetness of a celebration without tasting the bitterness of what I did to you? Halima stepped forward, her voice like iron, like the ringing of a bell in an empty hall. Be silent, she said, her eyes hard and cold. You are dying, and still you spit your poison like a serpent that does not know its head has been cut off. You are nothing but a dying snake, still trying to bite, still trying to spread your venom even as the life drains out of you. Daphne coughed again, a wet, terrible sound that shook her entire body, and she laughed once more, weaker this time, the sound fading even as it left her lips. Halima, she whispered, her voice so faint now that they had to lean forward to hear it, you have no mind. You have only rage. You have only the fire that burns within you, and that fire will consume you. It will burn away everything that is good in you, everything that could have made you happy. You will never become the wife of a chieftain because you do not know how to be anything other than a warrior. You do not know how to be soft, how to be gentle, how to be loved. Darsan will never be yours because you cannot hold him with the hands that are made only for killing. And as those words left her mouth, as the last of her poison was finally spent, the strength went out of her. Her head fell forward, her chin coming to rest on her chest, and the life drained out of her like water through cupped hands, like sand through the fingers of a closing fist. Her body went slack and the forest fell silent. Fatima stood over her for a long moment, looking down at the woman who had haunted them for so long, who had cast such a long shadow over their lives, who had caused so much pain and suffering and sorrow. Her face was unreadable, a mask of stillness, and then she spoke quietly, almost as a final benediction, as a closing of a chapter that had gone on far too long. You forced us to carry so many sorrows, she said. You filled our lives with fear and doubt and heartbreak. But you will never again give pain to anyone. You will never again whisper your poison into the ears of the innocent. You will never again weave your webs of deception. You have met your end, Daphne. May the earth lie heavy upon you. The wind moved through the trees, the leaves shivered, and the forest seemed to exhale, as if the very woods themselves had been holding their breath, waiting for this moment. The morning sun rose higher, casting golden light through the canopy, and the shadows that had seemed so dark and threatening began to retreat, began to shrink, began to fade in the face of the new day. And then the scene shifts, and in another part of that same vast woodland, Yakid was running. He had seen Daphne fall, had seen the dagger find its mark, had seen the life leave her body, and the sight had filled him with a terror that he had never known before. They were falling, all of them, one by one, and he was next. He was the last thread of their conspiracy, and if he was caught, there would be no one left to carry on their work. There would be no one to remember their cause. There would be nothing left but the story of their failure. His cloak was torn, his sword was still in his hand, but his hand was shaking so badly that the blade quivered like a leaf in a storm. His eyes darted from tree to tree like the eyes of a man who knows the executioner is one step behind him, who can feel the noose brushing against his neck with every step he takes. He crashed through the undergrowth, caring nothing for stealth, caring nothing for silence, driven by the single primal urge to survive. His lungs burned with the effort, and his mind raced, searching for any path of escape, any crack in the wall that was closing in around him, any hidden door that might lead him to safety. And then he burst into a clearing, and his blood went cold. Standing there in the center of that open space, his feet planted wide, his arms folded across his chest, his eyes fixed on Yakid with the calm, patient stillness of a man who has been waiting a long time for this moment, was Orhan Sahib himself. He was alone, or so it seemed, but the presence of him, the sheer weight of his authority, the sense of inevitability that radiated from him like heat from a fire, was enough to stop a man's heart. There is nowhere left for you to run, Yakid, Orhan said, his voice carrying across the clearing with the quiet certainty of a stone dropping into still water. Drop your sword to the ground. Your running is over. Your scheming is over. Your life as you have known it is over. Yakid looked around frantically, searching for a way out, and that was when he saw them. From every side, from between every pair of trees, from behind every bush and rock, the warriors of Orhan emerged. They rose from the earth like ghosts, their blades catching the morning light, their eyes fixed on him with the cold, hard gaze of men who have been hunting for a long time and have finally cornered their prey. He was surrounded. There was no gap in the circle. There was no path through the wall of steel and flesh. There was nothing left but surrender or death. Shammel stepped forward, his sword held loosely in his hand, his face showing no emotion, no anger, no triumph. He looked at Yakid as one might look at a broken tool, something that had once been useful but was now fit only to be discarded. If you must die, he said, his voice flat and matter-of-fact, at least die with some dignity. Do not make your final moments a spectacle of cowardice. Do not give the bards something to sing about for generations, a song of how the great Yakid begged and wept and groveled before his end. Yakid looked from face to face, searching for some sign of mercy, some softening of the eyes, some hint that he might be allowed to live. But there was nothing. These were not men who could be moved by pleading. These were not women who could be swayed by tears. These were people who had seen too much of his cruelty, who had suffered too much from his schemes, to feel anything but the cold satisfaction of justice finally being done. And then from the other side of the clearing, 3 figures emerged. Fatima walked at the center, her face still bearing the marks of her ordeal, the black smudges of smoke still on her cheeks, but her eyes were clear and steady. On her left walked Esporcha, her hand still resting on the hilt of the dagger she had thrown, and on her right walked Halima, her hair still wild from the chase, her clothes still torn from the battle, but her chin was high and her shoulders were straight. Together they advanced into the clearing, the 3 women who had hunted down and killed Daphne, and their presence added a new weight to the air, a new sense of finality. The Daphne with whom you wove your schemes is dead, Yakid, Fatima said, her voice ringing clear across the clearing. There is no one left to save you. There is no one coming to your aid. Your allies have fallen one by one, and now you stand alone, the last leaf on a tree that has been cut down at the roots. You schemed and you plotted and you wore 1,000 masks, each one more deceptive than the last. You whispered lies in the ears of the powerful. You twisted the truth into shapes that served your purposes. You did everything you could to destroy us, to tear us apart, to scatter us to the winds, and you failed. You lost, Yakid. Accept it. Lay down your pride along with your sword and let this end without more blood. Ebreno stepped forward from among the trees, his voice carrying a quiet certainty, a calm that came from having been through the fire himself. You will never again deceive another soul, he said. You will never again twist the truth into a weapon. Your days of betrayal are over. The web you wove has been torn apart, and the spiders who wove it with you are dead. You are the last thread, Yakid, and even now you are being pulled loose from the fabric of the world. And then Arhan stepped closer, his boots crunching on the dry leaves, his face a mask of cold judgment. Indeed, he will deceive no one again, Arhan said, his voice low and vibrating with barely contained fury. He and his father were devoured by their own greed. They thought they could kill Arhan and take the throne of Bursa for themselves. They thought their careful planning, their patient scheming, their willingness to do whatever was necessary would carry them to the heights of power. But they forgot one thing. They forgot that fate does not always smile upon the schemer. They forgot that there is a justice that cannot be bribed or deceived or outrun. And as those words left his lips, Arhan struck. The blow came so suddenly, so powerfully that Yakid did not even have time to flinch. The back of Arhan's hand caught him across the face with a crack that echoed through the clearing, and Yakid's legs gave way beneath him. He crashed to the ground, his sword flying from his hand, blood already beginning to trickle from the corner of his mouth. He lay there dazed, staring up at the canopy of leaves above him, the world spinning around him. Arhan drew his sword with a sound like a sigh, the blade sliding from its sheath with a whisper of steel, and he held its point at Yakid's throat, pressing just hard enough that the skin dimpled beneath the pressure. He looked down at the fallen man, his eyes holding nothing but cold disgust, the disgust of a man who has seen too much of this kind of evil to feel anything but contempt for those who practice it. But there is one thing you forgot, Yakid, Arhan said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than any shout. Evil must always meet defeat. It is the law of this world. It is the law of God. You can scheme and you can plot and you can poison and you can kill, and for a time it may seem that you have won, that your darkness has conquered the light, but the light always returns. The dawn always comes. And when it does, the darkness is driven back into the shadows where it belongs. You thought you could overcome that law, you thought you were the exception, but you are not. You are like every other servant of evil who has walked this earth, and you will fall just as they fell. Yakid, his lip bleeding, his pride in ruins, his hopes shattered, sneered up at him. The sneer was a pale shadow of the arrogance that had once defined him, but it was still there, still flickering in his dying spirit. Who do you think you are, he spat, the words coming out thick and wet with blood. Who do you think you are to speak of good? You who has never considered anyone but yourself. You who has ridden over 100 lives in your pursuit of power. You who speaks of righteousness as if your hands were clean, as if you had never done anything wrong, as if you were some holy saint descended from heaven. You are no different than me. You are a killer. You are a conqueror. You have buried as many enemies as I have. Do not pretend that you stand on higher ground, Orhan. You do not. You stand on the same ground, stained with the same blood, and you always have. Orhan looked down at him, and for a long moment he did not speak. He simply looked into Yakid's eyes, searching for something, perhaps for a flicker of the man that might have been, for some trace of the person Yakid could have become if he had chosen a different path, if he had not been so consumed by his own ambition. But there was nothing. There was only the shell of a man who had been hollowed out by his own choices, a man who had become nothing more than the sum of his own betrayals. I would take your life right here, Orhan said at last, his voice low and heavy, and it would be just. It would be fitting. It would be what you deserve. But I will not stain my sword with your blood. It would be a waste of good steel. Your blood is the blood of Ali Azel Jok, the blood of a house that has been corrupted by its own greed, and so you will die by the rope, as is the custom for those who have betrayed the trust of their sultan. The rope will be the only crown you wear, Yakid. The noose will be the only throne you ascend. He turned to his soldiers who stood waiting, their faces grim and determined. Take him away, Orhan ordered. Bind his hands. Prepare the gallows. He will hang at sundown so that all may see what becomes of those who plot against the peace of the realm. Orhan turned his back and he began to walk away. And in that instant, Yakid moved. It was a desperate, final, animal act of defiance, the last thrashing of a snake whose head had been cut off but whose body still twitched. From a hidden sheath no one had noticed, sewn into the lining of his sleeve, he drew a small, wicked blade, a blade he had carried for years, a blade he had always saved for some final, desperate moment. He lunged upward, his eyes wild with the fury of a man who has nothing left to lose, and he drove the blade toward Orhan's back, aiming for the space between the shoulder blades, aiming for the heart. The cry went up from every throat in the clearing. It rose into the air like a scream of pure horror, a warning that came too late, a prayer that had not been answered. Sultan Orhan, the words were torn from the throats of his companions, his warriors, his friends, his brothers. But Orhan had not survived this long, had not fought this many battles, had not faced this many enemies by being slow to react. He turned faster than any man of his size had a right to move, faster than thought, faster than fate itself. His hand shot out and caught Yakid's wrist in a grip of iron, and for a moment they stood frozen, locked in a tableau of violence and desperation. Yakid's eyes were wide, his teeth bared, his whole body straining to drive the blade home. But he could not move. Orhan's grip was unbreakable, a vice of muscle and will that held him captive. And then with one terrible motion, Orhan twisted. He turned the blade in Yakid's hand, turned it back toward the body of the man who had brought it, and with a single, powerful thrust, he drove the hidden weapon deep into Yakid's own chest. The sound that came from Yakid was not a scream. It was a sigh, a long, slow exhalation of air and life and hope, as if everything that had made him who he was flowing out of him through that wound. Orhan pressed down, his teeth clenched, his eyes burning with a cold, white fire, and he held the blade in place, pressing it deeper, pressing with the full weight of his fury, his disappointment, his grief at what this man could have been and what he had chosen to become. He pressed until Yakid's struggles ceased, until his eyes went glassy, until his body went limp in his grasp. Then, slowly, carefully, Orhan released him, and Yakid's body crumpled to the ground, his own weapon still buried in his chest, the blood spreading across the forest floor like a dark flower opening its petals to the morning sun. Fatima looked away for a moment, her face pale, her hand rising to cover her mouth. She had seen death before, many times, but there was something about this one, about the way it had come, the way the schemer had died by his own hidden blade, that struck a deep chord within her. Orhan stood over the corpse, his chest heaving, his sword still in his hand though he had not used it. He looked down at the body of Yakid, at the man who had caused so much pain, who had woven so many schemes, who had tried to tear apart everything he had built. His voice, when it came, was soft, almost gentle, as if he were speaking a eulogy for a man who had long since lost his way. "You have received what was owed to you, Yakid," he said. "Not by my hand, but by your own. It is better this way. Let your own treachery be your grave. Let your own weapon be your executioner. It is fitting in its way. The snake at last has been bitten by its own fangs." The scene shifts once more, and now we find ourselves within the cool stone walls of the Palace of Bursa, where the morning light slants through tall windows, casting long golden rectangles across the marble floors. The air is cool and still, scented with rosewater and old wood, and the sounds of the city drifting through the open windows are muted, distant, like the memory of a dream. Niloufar stands by one of those windows, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls, beyond the city, beyond the horizon itself. She has been standing there for a long time, motionless, lost in the labyrinth of her own thoughts. The weight of her position, of her responsibilities, of her place in the heart of the Sultan, presses down on her shoulders like an invisible cloak, heavy and warm and constant. And then soft footsteps approach behind her, the rustle of silk against stone, the gentle breathing of someone who has come to offer comfort. Malhatan, mother of the Sultan, comes to stand beside her, her presence calm and steady as an old river that has been flowing for centuries. She does not speak immediately. She simply stands side by side with Niloufar, looking out at the same distant horizon, sharing the same silence, the same space of quiet understanding. Then at last Malhatan speaks, her voice low and warm like honey melting in the sun. "My child," she says, "you have spent too many hours troubled by your place in the eyes and heart of Orhan. I have watched you and I have seen the questions that move behind your eyes like shadows under water. You wonder if you are worthy. You wonder if you are enough. You wonder if there is some other woman somewhere who could love him better, serve him better, stand beside him with more grace and strength." She pauses and her hand reaches out, taking Niloufar's hand in her own, her fingers warm and steady. "Look at me, my daughter," she says, "you have no reason to wonder. The most precious thing my son possesses, the thing he values more than his own life, more than his throne, more than his honor, he has placed into your keeping. He has given you his trust. He has given you his heart. He has chosen you, Niloufar. Out of all the women in all the lands, he has chosen you to walk beside him on this path. Let that be enough, let that be all the assurance you need." Niloufar turns to her, and the morning light catches her face, revealing the traces of tears that have been shed in the quiet hours of the night. Her voice trembles only slightly as she speaks, the words coming from a place of deep sincerity. "I am ready to give my life upon this path," she says. "I am ready to do whatever is required of me, to face whatever challenges come, to sacrifice whatever must be sacrificed. But Allah knows, mother, I am afraid. I am deeply, deeply afraid. Not of the enemies, not of the dangers, not of the hardships that lie ahead. I am afraid of failing him. I am afraid that I will somehow wound the trust he has placed in me, that I will make some mistake, that I will not be strong enough, wise enough, good enough to deserve the faith he has shown me." Malhatan looks at her with eyes that have seen generations pass, that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, that have watched children grow into rulers and rulers grow into legends. Her smile is gentle, touched with the wisdom of a woman who has known her own fears and faced her own doubts. "Be afraid," she says. "Fear can be a teacher if you let it. It can make you careful. It can make you attentive. It can keep you from the arrogance that brings down the mighty. But never forget the strength of your own heart, Niloufar. Never forget that you are not made of glass. You are made of iron, wrapped in silk, fierce and gentle at the same time. You are the guardian of the trust of this state. You are the one who will ensure that the peace my son has fought for will endure. To ensure that peace, you must accept everything that comes with this realm, both the sweetness and the bitterness. You must hold it all, the joy and the sorrow, the triumph and the failure, the light and the shadow. That is what it means to be a ruler's partner. That is what it means to be a queen." Niloufar's gaze clears and a new light begins to shine in her eyes, the light of understanding, of acceptance, of a decision made and held firm. She lifts her head and she meets Malhatan's gaze directly, her voice steady now, sure of itself in a way that it was not before. "Mother," she says, "all of that is in the past now. With this day, with this letter, with the decisions we have made, the old wounds have been left behind. Jealousy, anger, resentment, suspicion, all of them are things of yesterday. They no longer have a hold on me. They no longer shape my thoughts or my choices. From this moment forward, I will work without rest to keep our state standing forever. I will be the wall that defends it, the foundation that supports it, the light that guides it through the darkness. We have much to do, mother.